Chapter 891. Lionel never thought he would feel such an intoxicating feeling so soon again. At least, he didn't think he would leave the fourth dimension so soon. However, he hardly got to enjoy it because he realized it was just barely enough. The high of entering yet another dimension felt full when you realized your power wasn't as amazing as you thought it would be. Of course, if others knew Lionel's thoughts, they'd deem him to be insane. In just a single step, Lionel's split minds now approach 1,000,000. On top of this, he felt the gates of his metal synergy lineage factor calling out to him. Compared to the last time when he struggled, opening the gates before he had even completed his 9 nodes, this time would be a completely different animal. At the same time, Lionel's star fusion reached a new height, now fueled by 5th-dimensional vital star force, and Lionel also finally felt that he could use his scarlet star force for a few split seconds before his body imploded into a pile of ash. There were sweeping changes with Lionel's lineage factors. He felt that the burden of using his divine armor was practically non-existent now, and on top of all of that, his ability seemed to have transcended to a new height. Even though Lionel would never be able to cross the savant barrier and reach manifestation, Lionel had been able to cross into the 4th level, control. This allowed him to control his own body as though it was a machine his mind was within. In fact, Lionel felt that he had reached a point where he could even control the speed of his own cell division. This was the absolute greatest height that Lionel's Dream Force ability could reach. Of course, Lionel had yet to have any practice with it. And controlling the body down to a cellular level with only 1,000,000 split minds was a fool's game. In addition, even if he could control his cell division, anyone with even the faintest background in biology would be able to tell you that such a thing required energy to execute. The good news was that vital star force was among the best energies to fuel such a thing. The bad news was that it would only be an endless supply for Lionel in this place. Anywhere else and he would have to slowly catalyze and store it for himself with the help of his vital stars. None of this even mentioned the fact that Lionel hadn't had the time to create new branching abilities based on his new peak. And he hadn't gotten time to learn to control or practice with it either. It could be said that he had been given a big railgun that he was far too small to use at this point. The best way Lionel could describe it was like he felt that he was just a hair away from having and controlling as much power as a savant. And yet, he didn't have nearly their luck in receiving the blessings of the dimensional verse. He had to figure everything out and, most importantly, power everything with his own energy. All of this, not to mention the ever-increasing difficulty of the puzzles he continued to run into, dampened what should have been a happy moment considerably. The only good news was that he had been here for long enough to solidify himself in the 4th dimension. But it seemed that the bad news was intent on continuing to come. Lionel stared at the young man in front of him. Though his expression was closed off and gave nothing away, he felt a solemn feeling welling up in his heart. The intuition of the primitive consciousness had only grown stronger and more potent after being incorporated into Lionel's spear domain lineage factor. With that potency came an increased sensitivity toward danger. It was just that Lionel hadn't run into any such opponents since he realized the true purpose of his spear domain lineage factor. However, right now it was screaming at him, screaming that even if he used the 3rd form of star fusion, even if he was released from the shackles this world had on him, even if this young man was under double the suppression he was currently under, none of it would change the inevitable outcome. Lionel didn't respond to the young man's question. Instead, he looked at the sword in his hand. It only took a glance for Lionel to tell that the young man was holding a normal wooden sword. It reminded Lionel of the first primitive spear he had ever managed to take out of the spear domain heirloom. However, Lionel knew for a fact that if he took out the primitive spear right this moment, the level of danger he exuded wouldn't even be half of the young man's. Amory didn't seem to care very much for Lionel's response, he only continued to look at the ring. Well, this is pretty lucky if I do say so myself. Amory smiled. I'm quite a fan of competition, but if to be honest, I could have defeated you back when I was still a toddler. So, I don't think there's any real point to this, right? I'm not a bloodthirsty man so I can let you live. But you'll have to hand over that ring. I happen to know someone that would be far better suited to it than you. I'd like to have a good battle when the time comes, and I have a feeling you won't be able to give me one. Lionel didn't respond to this, but that didn't change the fact that he was confused by the young man's words. He wanted to give his ring to someone else so that, when the time came, he could have a better battle than he would have otherwise had with Lionel. What was that supposed to mean? Seeing that Lionel didn't respond, Amory sighed and shook his head. Forget it, forget it. Every time I try not to end things with blood, no one wants to listen. Amory took a step forward and brandished his wooden sword. I don't like to give second chances. Chapter 892. Could Lionel give spear domain over just to save his own life? The answer was obviously no. This was something his father had left behind for him, and it was the heirloom of the Morales family. He had no intention of losing it in this place. But at the same time, Lionel felt like he had really painted himself into a corner. He already knew that receiving the next portion of dimensional cleanse had become impossible. He had no illusions about defeating Amory. However, the main issue was that though jumping from the edge of the road seemed to be just 2 steps away in the current situation, Lionel felt like it was a world away. That was how far apart the skill between the two young men were. Still, the more helpless it all seemed, the colder and colder Lionel's expression became. By the time Amory had raised his foot to take a second step, Lionel's countenance was like an iceberg, his features all individually carved out in the strongest of lines. Amory paused, scanning Lionel up and down before shaking his head. Definitely not worthy. Emotionless, blockheads like you should stick to fighting with your fists, at least that way you won't be drawing a line between yourself and your weapon. How can you hear your blade if you don't want to hear it? What a sad excuse for a spearman. Lionel didn't react to this in the slightest. Even though they were said in a different way, hadn't he already heard these words once before? It was exactly what Old Man Hutch had told him when he tried to get him to switch to the machete. Lionel simply didn't believe that a weapon needed to be loved. He had said it then and he would say it again. He had chosen the spear out of convenience because he just so happened to have been born with a lineage factor that suited it. If he had affinity with a sword or saber or a machete, he would have chosen that as well. All this rambling about loving your weapon and communicating with it sounded like the ravings of a madman to Lionel. To him, it felt like Old Man Hutch and this young man before him were both abstract artists trying to convince you that the banana they taped to the wall had a deeper, underlying meaning you were just missing because you didn't get it. Their words fell into the same pot of ridiculousness for Lionel. As far as he was concerned, these two just had talent in the blades they chose and explained away their innate gifts with nonsense like love and emotion, when the truth was that they were just better suited to those weapons in comparison to others. To Lionel it was just that simple. However, at least now he understood why it was that Amory said he wasn't worthy. Unfortunately, that changed nothing. How would Lionel face his father if he lost the heirloom he had been entrusted with? How would he subdue the Morales family if he lost something so precious to them without having even earned the right to have it in the first place? How would he look himself in the mirror if he couldn't manage to take 2 steps to the left against an enemy no older than himself? Lionel's palm flipped over, his body suddenly erupting with vital star force from head to toe. But this time, it felt far different than it had in the past even as his runes flickered to life. Rather than a billowing diamond blue steam, he suddenly began to radiate an incomparably majestic amethyst. From top to bottom, his body was surrounded by a delicate light violet hue, his hair becoming an endless river of foggy energy and his eyes becoming homogeneous with it all. This was Lionel's third form of star fusion, King's Might. Even with his aura rising like a tide, Lionel didn't make a single move. He brandished his spear, his nerves walking a cliff's edge. However, it was then that it happened. Compared to Lionel, Amory's aura was a wisp of nothingness. He stood there, his robes completely unaffected by what should have been winds that would put any hurricane to shame. In one instant he was 10 meters from Lionel, his body having not moved a single inch. In the next, Lionel's pupils constricted to an extreme. A wooden blade appeared before his nose, slashing downward with a slow, unhurried momentum that simultaneously weighed as heavy as a mountain. Despite how much effort Lionel had put into watching his every action, despite how much care and attention he had placed toward predicting his next movement, it had all been completely useless. Lionel's life flashed before his eyes. No matter how hard he thought, he couldn't seem to think of a method to survive. It was crushing. In just those few milliseconds, Lionel's mind seemed to slow down the events into a stretched length of time that spanned what almost felt like several days. What did it feel like to be contemplating your own death for so long? One would think that it would be enough to drive a person mad. It was like a ticking clock set to come to a stop the moment you breathed your last. How would it feel to know the exact date, time and second of your death? How would one feel as the moments waned and the sand within the hourglass became lesser and lesser? How would you feel watching a guillotine being taken to your future aspirations and goals? Maybe you might even find the humor in it all. Why was it that your mind was slowing everything down to such an extent now, but couldn't have done so while the person who wanted your life was swinging his sword? Lionel was in exactly this sort of hopeless situation, a lethal wooden blade descending like a heavenly punishment to sever his ties to the world. Chapter 893? Chapter 893, not bad indeed. Why is it all so slow now? That must be why. Lionel was unaware of the vast difference between the fifth and sixth dimensions. But, someone moving so fast that even his own internal sight couldn't keep up with it was enough to lay it out to bear right in front of him. It was clear that Amory was on a level so far beyond himself that it was impossible to fathom, and that was even while being weighed down by 4 rounds worth of vital star force. Now that he knew, he realized why his intuition had been screaming at him to run all this time. But, running was impossible. The moment he took a step back he would be finished. Lionel's spear was held between both hands in the most defensive stance that he could muster. And yet, Amory had a complete disregard for it as he attacked as though his spear wasn't there at all. However, it was exactly this disregard that gave Lionel the faintest hope for survival. Lionel's arm exploded. This wasn't a metaphor, it wasn't a fancily worded set of prose, but rather an accurate description of exactly what happened. Right at his elbow, Lionel's arm imploded into a rain of blood and gore. It was such a vicious, cold-hearted, blood-curdling wound that even Amory's brow furrowed lightly even as his sword continued downward. However, it was this explosion that erupted Lionel's arm into movement, arching his spear upward in a move that was seemingly intent on forcing it into the path of Amory's blade. Amory's furrowed brow smoothed out just as quickly as it formed. To him this didn't matter in the slightest. He would show Lionel the difference between the two of them as clear as day. His wooden spear was of a common grade. It couldn't even be ranked among fourth-dimensional weapons, and even Earth's third-dimensional cold weapons would be able to slash it apart 10 out of 10 times. At the same time, Lionel was holding a double-sided quasi-silver spear. The difference in quality was as clear as day. It should be a given that the latter would block the former. And yet, Amory felt that anyone would be a fool to believe such a thing. A quasi-silver weapon? It might as well have been a piece of tinfoil to him. He had already given Lionel a chance to live. Since he didn't want it, this would be his deathbed. Amory's sword continued to descend, an air of confidence hanging around him. One could tell from the aura he exuded that no matter what stood before him, he would slice it apart. It was an air that matched Lionel's king's might and even far surpassed it, and yet it wasn't contingent on subordinates or a number of them, it was entirely reliant on Amory's belief in himself and his blade. Goodbye. Bang. Amory's expression suddenly changed. It was just a small flicker of light within his irises, but it was a change nonetheless. Lionel's hand exploded into a mist of blood, his bones sprinkling down like ash and his flesh falling like lumps of processed meat. In that very instant, what had once been the hand of an elite force crafter had become nothing but a mangled mess, impossible to see the start or finish of. Lionel flew backward like an arrow leaving a bowstring, a side of his body completely collapsing to the point that his inner organs threatened to spill out. Just a casual strike from Amory left him in a half-dead state, his breathing hardly holding on. If it wasn't for the fact he had entered the control level of his ability index, allowing him to force his inner organs to stay functioning as best he could, he really might have died to just that single strike. Lionel crashed along the road, sliding back to the point he landed on its very edge. Even though the vital star force within him was trying to quickly fuel Lionel's cells to begin repairing themselves, they found that no amount of energy they provided was enough. Something was far too special about Amory's force. It seemed to hinder Lionel from being able to heal himself, at least through normal means like this. It was only after Lionel began to fight back against Amory's aura with his own king's might that things began to shift. But even then it was only because it was a casual swing on Amory's part. Not bad. Amory spoke. He seemed to truly mean his words, there wasn't a hint of derision or disdain hidden within them. He was actually praising Lionel. You knew that your spear wouldn't be enough, so you used the ring to block even at the cost of your hand. I believe it was the Morales family that had the spear domain ring, right? Hands are quite important to you force crafters. I guess I don't have to feel too bad about you surviving that strike, then. Lionel didn't respond. Even now, as he sat at the edge of the road, a step away from surviving, his senses had never stopped locking onto Amory. This time, however, he used his auspicious air and kept his body in a state of near death, slowing down everything to an extreme. It had taken a few seconds for Amory to speak those words. And yet, to Lionel, it felt like it had taken him hours to finish. Well, I guess you've earned it, then. Next time we meet, I definitely won't make the same mistake again. The domain rings shouldn't be in the hands of people who can't appreciate them. Lionel didn't say a single word. Even with his mangled hand, he managed to pin the spear domain ring between the ground meat that was it and his badly caved-in chest. He rolled over the edge of the road, just barely dodging a secret strike of Amory's, the spear domain ring tightly clenched to his heart. You dodged that one too, huh? Not bad. Not bad indeed. Amory's laughter was all Lionel could hear as his body whistled through the abyss below. Make sure to remember my name well. I am Amory, the sword deity. When next we meet, I'll take your life. Chapter 894. Chapter 894. Twice Lionel instantly appeared on the very same abandoned planet he had left from, hanging onto his life by a thread. But the situation instantly became several times worse. There wasn't a hint of oxygen to be found on this planet, but that was only the first issue. At Lionel's current level, holding his breath for several hours wasn't a problem. The trouble came from the lack of air pressure. In that instant, his bodily fluids seemed to want to boil themselves to oblivion. If it wasn't for the fact Lionel had stepped into the fifth dimension, he would already be finished. It only made matters worse that the temperature felt far below -100 degrees Celsius. As Lionel progressed, temperature began to feel different to him and was adjusted not just based on the dimension, but also how he felt within that dimension. For him to experience such cold right now, it could only be said that this planet was not just a little bit harsh. Without his space shuttle to protect him, Lionel was facing all the elements by himself, his body far too weak to protect himself from it all. With the last hints of strength he had, Lionel managed to use his internal sight to pull the segmented cube out from his spatial ring and teleport inside. Lionel instantly took a massive breath, one he just as quickly regretted. His nerves were completely fried, the constant firing of pain receptors making his mind feel as though it was in a minefield, flashbangs sounding time and time again with every minor movement he made. At that moment, Lionel's expression would have warped into quite an ugly one if he could have afforded the energy. He had thought that after so many months within the dimensional cleanse trial world, his healing branches, instant recovery, would have already recovered after he used it to survive the Valiant Zone. But now he realized that he had made a massive mistake. Why did his instant recovery have such a variable refresh date to the point where even Lionel could only vaguely say that it would take a few months? It was because of the process his lineage factor went through to prepare it. Instant recovery required a special fusion of light elemental and star elemental forces to combine to be completed. However, Lionel had just spent months in a place where no force other than star force was allowed. So how could his instant recovery have possibly recovered? Lionel had no choice but to try to use vital star force again, but once again the world seemed to want to see him suffer. First, he was slapped in the face with the reality that the large amounts of vital star force he had become used to was gone. Even to call it a fraction of what he once had was an insult, it was more like a sliver. Second, he realized that Amory's odd energy still hadn't disappeared and it was still hindering his body from healing itself. It was borderline infuriating. What Lionel didn't know was that this was how things were meant to be. Being injured by someone an entire dimension above you made the same wound far more difficult to heal. A cut caused by fifth-dimensional force, even at the same size and depth as one caused by fourth-dimensional force, would be far more difficult to deal with. Lionel had never experienced this issue before because of his own talent. But now he had met someone just as if not more talented than himself for the very first time. On top of that, that person was within the sixth dimension whose gap with the fifth dimension was far larger than the latter's gap with the fourth and so on. As though all of that wasn't enough, Lionel's illusion that Amory had access to an ability similar to King's Might wasn't wrong. And this energy hindered Lionel's ability to heal far more than even Amory's sixth-dimensional force did. Yep. Little Black Star appeared above Lionel, jumping to and fro with a panicked expression on his little face. He had thought that it was great that Lionel was finally back. He had been bored of just playing with little Tali all the time. Plus, for safety, Lionel had locked Candle and Vice away in the snow globes before he left to the trial because they simply progressed too fast, so there was no one else. And yet, just when he came to greet Lionel, he found him in a half-dead state, in a hallway of the abode setting, with blood pooling around him faster and faster. The sound was like the sound of an angel to Lionel. Little Black Star, drag me to the bathhouse. Lionel had been too focused on just getting into the segmented cube to think about exactly where it would be best that he went. Luckily, Black Star had appeared, or else he really might be finished this time. Maybe if he was lucky enough, the cleansing waters would be able to purge his body of Amory's aura, or at least help him suppress it. Little Black Star didn't take long to understand. A black fog appeared beneath Lionel and acted as a bed to pull him along. Little Black Star struggled to maintain it as Amory's aura corroded even his dark elemental force, but he managed to grit his teeth through it. Lionel never thought he would end up in such a sorry state. His intuition had told him that Amory would easily slice his spear in two along with his body if he tried to block with it. So, his only choice had been to use the spear domain heirloom as a last-effort defense, believing that it definitely had to be a top-quality treasure. Unfortunately, just to get it in Amory's way, he had to shatter his own elbow and explode it with star force to get it to move fast enough. Then, as though all that wasn't bad enough, the form of the ring was obviously far too small to give him any extra protection. The result was Amory's strength dispersing around it and nearly killing Lionel. The good news? As expected, the ring didn't have a single scratch on it. The bad news? Well, just look at him. When Little Black Star finally got him to the cleansing waters, Lionel let out a roar that threatened to shatter the segmented cube apart. Lionel had seemingly forgotten something else. What did the segmented cube need to evolve? It was fifth-dimensional force, was it not? Where had the segmented cube been for the last almost year? Was it not in a place that not only had large amounts of fifth-dimensional force, but also large amounts of sixth and even seventh-dimensional force? The cleansing waters Lionel had just had Little Black Star drop him into was no longer the fourth-dimensional cleansing waters he had become used to. In fact, it was a completely different beast entirely. At that moment, Lionel felt like he was being boiled from the inside out. The more pain and setbacks he experienced, the more muddled his mind seemed to become and the more mistakes he seemed to make. And clearly, this was another one. The segmented cube had evolved not just once in the past several months, but twice. Chapter 895. Chapter 895. Bite you to death. Lionel felt like he was being boiled from the inside out. He immediately realized that this weren't the cleansing waters he had been expecting. In fact, if not for the fact he was so focused on keeping his body alive and couldn't spare internal sight to take a glance at his surroundings, he would have realized that the segmented cube he had come to know was a completely different beast at this moment. What Lionel didn't know was that these were sixth-dimensional cleansing waters as opposed to the fourth-dimensional waters he had become accustomed to. It was a bit exaggerated to say that these waters were like rubbing alcohol to Lionel, but it was functionally the same at this very moment. These cleansing water were too good at wiping away foreign objects from existence. The issue was that it had decided that much of what was in Lionel's body could be classified as such. When one was trying to measure the body of a fifth-dimensional existence, especially when Lionel's metal body was still within the fourth dimension, up against the standards of a sixth-dimensional one, the gap was simply too wide and the process could be seen as abrasive. The cleansing waters were essentially flushing out all the impurities of Lionel's body, but it had chosen the absolute worst time to do exactly that because Lionel had open flesh wounds all over himself. Even as jets of ink black shot out from his body and Amory's aura was completely purged, the process of them flooding out from him was so savage that Lionel felt as though he was being ripped from the inside out. If Lionel's father had been here, he would have coughed up a lung from laughing so hard. Only his idiot son could possibly turn one of the gentlest existences in the whole of the dimensional verse into one of the most dangerous just because he forgot to use his head. Lionel tried to remain lucid, but it was growing in difficulty the more and more time passed. He hardly registered when the last of Amory's aura shot out from himself, so he also didn't realize that he should be doing his very best to heal at this moment. At the same time, his consciousness began to slip away, his mind jarred by the flashbangs of pain. It had been a long time since Lionel had run dry of his dream force. But truth be told, he really didn't have a choice this time. Had he not poured everything he had into his battle with Amory, he wouldn't even be able to scream out in pain this way, because he would be dead. Unfortunately, because he ran out of dream force, he no longer had the ability to use dream sense to dull his pain receptors, and his mind also became incredibly foggy at the same time. If not for the pain, he would have long since passed out. And the moment he did lose consciousness, he would be finished. What Lionel couldn't see at this moment, though, was that a little girl who was all motes of light from the waist down was hanging in the air, looking down at him as though she was gazing upon the world's greatest idiot. What is wrong with this gene pool? Both father and son are fools. Foolish, foolish, foolish. Humph, I should just let him die. The little girl was adorable to an extreme. Her eyes were large and sparkling, her chubby cheeks triggered the impulse to pinch, and the way her small little hands rested on her waist made her look like a miniature adult that could make even the most stoic man's heart burst with a willingness to die protecting her. And yet, the words she spoke were so vicious. Though the little girl was visibly annoyed, she still waved a hand and caused Lionel's half-unconscious body to rise up from the water. The truth was that his state was terrible. His arm had imploded at the elbow and its hand was nothing more than a mangled mess. Beneath that, his chest had half caved in and was threatening to leak out inner organs of its own. His face was a sickly shade of white and his hair, which was usually a sparkling light violet, had lost whatever color it usually had as he hung on by a thread. Annoying. I was so close to the seventh dimension, but this little fool made me wake up early. Now all that energy is disappearing. Annoying. 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 Who knows when hell enter a seventh dimensional world with such rich energy like that again. Even while she was enraged, the little girl still continued to wave her hands about. Activate, force conversion. Set target to vital star force. Convert to. The little girl sent a gaze toward Lionel. Snow force. The moment the little girl finished these words, rays of light began to fall upon Lionel. They looked like falling snowflakes at one moment, but soon began to look like falling feathers in the next. The purity was unmatched and the sights were gorgeous to an extreme. In just a few seconds, Lionel's instant recovery was filled to the brim and dream counter activated due to his near-death state. The moment this happened, Lionel began to recover at a speed even the naked eye had a hard time keeping up with. However, the little girl didn't seem satisfied. She continued to shake her head, looking at Lionel's hand. She was clearly hesitating about something. The instant recovery of a sixth-dimensional beast is not enough to heal that injury. His hand won't ever be the same if I let it heal like this. Forget it, just take this as payment for the future. If you can't raise me to the ninth dimension like your father promised me you would, I'll bite you to death. The little girl knew that there'd be a price to pay for doing this, but she had no choice. Change conversion to sixth-dimensional life force. Chapter 896. Chapter 896. Factory. Lionel shot up. He jumped so high that he thought he would have crashed into the ceiling barely halfway up, but he soon realized that somehow the walls of the segmented cube had become far taller. In fact, when he looked around, even as he began to fall back to the ground, his eyes couldn't help but widen. Lionel was still in the bathhouse. At this point, any blood that had been here had long since disappeared. But this was to be expected. After all, the self-cleaning function of the segmented cube's bathhouse was unmatched for obvious reasons. However, what Lionel saw wasn't the bathhouse he was used to, but what felt more like a bath mansion. No, a bath estate? No, a bath island? What the hell was going on? The bathhouse had suddenly become enormous. The pool couldn't even be described in meters anymore but could only have its dimensions broken down in kilometers. It was impossibly vast and could accommodate tens of thousands of people without issue. At the same time, this was just the tip of the iceberg. Lionel could see that there were several more bathrooms, resting rooms, in addition to new additions like saunas and massage rooms. It felt like an ultimate destination resort where the pool had instead become the beachfront for everyone to admire. What was most shocking was that in the sky. No, it was the fact that there was an actual sky at all. The dome of the bathhouse had become glass and above, blue skies, white clouds and a yellow sun could be seen. Lionel had the feeling that it was artificial, maybe due to a faint connection he had with the segmented cube, but it nonetheless all looked so real. When Lionel finally snapped out of it, he shuddered remembering what had happened to him. He could vaguely remember the sight of a little girl with motes of light for feet and legs in his half-unconscious state. But right now she was nowhere to be seen. Without a choice, Lionel could only do what he did best and ask the dictionary for help. Luckily, it was able to give him the straight answers he needed. There were 3 types of answers the dictionary could provide. One was where it scanned and provided an answer. This was where its greatest limitations lied. The second were recorded segments. This was where his father got a chance to be annoying. And the final were recorded answers. Recorded answers were a bit different because they weren't recordings of his father but rather recordings of things Lionel believed his father had written. For example, Lionel's force crafting lessons were recorded answers. And now, the deeper matters of the segmented cube seemed to have been unlocked as lessons as well. Lionel blinked. He hadn't known that the dictionary had hidden another tutorial for him. Usually, he needed to figure out the new abilities of the segmented cube on his own, and the only way he could do that was by walking around. But, obviously, with how large it had suddenly gotten, there was absolutely no way that he would be able to do the same now. Even though he could try, it was even more likely that he would miss something. Lionel, though, was quickly overwhelmed. As deep as his force crafting lessons were, the operation manual of the segmented cube was just as if not more intensive. It was a lab, a home, a hideout and a spaceship all in one. The fact that even Lionel was overwhelmed wasn't a surprise in the slightest. He had expected it to gain 1 or 2 more benefits with each step forward, but this was an exponential change he wasn't quite ready for. Yep. Lionel smiled as little Black Star jumped into his arms. If there was anyone who was worried, it was this little guy. Unfortunately, after bringing Lionel to the pool, there was nothing else he could have done. Don't worry, I'm here now, aren't I? I have a present for you. Lionel grinned and was about to take out a certain vial when he remembered how heavy it would be. He was definitely under no illusion that he would be able to easily carry it now. Lionel could have given little Black Star the vial to absorb previously. But he had been worried about the little guy running into trouble during a moment he couldn't reach out to help. Now though, the fact he waited made these matters almost too perfect. The suspended animation ability of the segmented cube had evolved from freezing biological processes to now being able to accelerate them as well. With its help, little Black Star would be able to absorb the blood in a stable environment while also finishing with greater speed. How long will it take little Black Star to finish absorbing the Void Beast blood with the help of accelerated animation? Lionel asked. Ping, 13 months, Lionel raised an eyebrow. That long? How long would it take without accelerated animation? Ping, 21 years, 20 times acceleration. I guess I can't be mad at that. Is there anything else I should prepare? Usually asking open-ended questions like this to the dictionary resulted in it rambling for hours. But Lionel still did so. This was little Black Star's life after all. He couldn't play around with it. Ping. It is advised that Seed read the Force Conversion Manual. Force Conversion? Wasn't that what that little girl had said? The more Lionel listened in on what Force Conversion could do, the more shocked he became. And the more shocked he became, the more possibilities sprang up in his mind. Each plan seemed crazier than the last. With the segmented cube's help and his crafting skill, he should become a very rich man very quickly. If he used this properly, his plans would immediately take several enormous leaps forward. In the end, he came to a simple conclusion. The segmented cube was a force crystal factory. Chapter 897. Chapter 897, Force Crystals. Force crystal mines were quite rare existences. Even after all of Lionel's travel, his stints on planet Valiant and even his robbery on planet Vincero, Lionel had still yet to run into a second force crystal mine after the one he found on Earth. What Lionel hadn't known back then was just how rare force crystal mines were. To be produced, they not only needed time, but they also needed a world of a certain talent to produce the force density that would be required. Even something like a force eruption, which had the function of quickly increasing the energy density of a world, was an absolutely rare event only the most talented of worlds would experience. Other worlds would have to slowly accumulate their force over time rather than being gifted it. If one thought about it, didn't it make more sense for the common currency of the dimensional verse to be force crystals as opposed to herb ore? Well, the harsh truth was that force crystals were so rare that it simply didn't make sense to demand them for payment. It would be the equivalent of 21st century Earth suddenly demanding that all services be paid for in diamonds. However, the segmented cube had a very unique ability called force conversion. The first and most obvious thing that could be accomplished was the conversion of one force to another. This alone was a shocking feat enough to shake the dimensional verse. It was a shocking enough ability that even though the Morales family allowed many to know of the existence of the Spear Domain heirloom, a very rare few were even aware of the existence of the segmented cube. To change from one form of energy to a higher form of it was practically the work of a god. Of course, there were drawbacks to this. Obviously, if you were converting from a lower level energy to a higher tier 1, it would require exponentially more of the lower level. However, this price alone was one most would scramble to match no matter what the cost. Not only could the segmented cube form higher levels of energy, it also had the ability to raise it to a higher dimension as well. In fact, the only cap on this was dependent on the level the segmented cube was at currently. At the moment, the segmented cube was in phase 4. As such, it could only raise a given force to the 6th dimension at best. But this was still shocking to an extreme. And it was just the first part. Lionel couldn't help but look toward his hand. As he was being healed, his consciousness was also slowly recovering. That had allowed him to see just how poorly his right hand had been healing. Had it had been allowed to continue, Lionel was able to guess that he would probably have to deal with some phantom pain and countless layers of scar tissue for the rest of his life. Or, at the very least, until he broke into the 7th dimension. But near the end, a far higher source of force in comparison to the Snowy Star Owl's snow force had invaded his wound and saved him from such a life. Toward this, Lionel could only be endlessly grateful. Without his hands in top condition, his force crafting would take a hit and he would have to change a lot of things about his plans. Lionel wanted to thank that little girl, but he had no idea where she was at this point. Shaking his head, Lionel turned his attention back to force conversion. maybe even more fearsome than the first ability, force conversion, was able to concentrate force into an incredibly pure form and create force crystals with them. The uses for force crystals were practically endless. They could be used to power weapons of extraordinary power. They could be used as the energy source for high-level, grand-scale force crafts. They could be used to speed up practice or meditation speed. They could be used to break through bottlenecks. They could be used to comprehend the use of new forces. They could be used to almost instantly replenish your stamina in battle. The list seemed to go on forever. Lionel had had no choice but to cut the dictionary off at one point. But he had latched onto one particular ability. Used to comprehend new forces? Everyone had an affinity, but this didn't mean that they couldn't use other elements. In addition, there were many with certain affinities that had always been boxed into using one particular kind of their element without ever exploring other options. Two examples of this were Snow Force and Scarlet Star Force for Lionel. Snow Force was a name Lionel was just learning today, having heard the young girl use it. Despite its name, it wasn't related to the water or ice element but was rather a fusion of light and star force. Compared to the fusion of Lionel's Scarlet Star Force, which was also a combination of both those elements along with fire, of course Snow Force was very much lacking. One was top 10 among Star Force, top 3 among Light Force and top 1 amongst Fire Force, but the other would be lucky to be ranked in the top 1000 of Star Force while it was not even top 100 in Light Force. What was the point of this? Well, it was all to say that Lionel had an exceptionally high affinity for the light and stars, but the only forms of the light element or star element he used were the ones he was innately aware of how to use. This was the same for most everyone else as well. It was difficult to grasp new forms of elemental energies. Many were simply forced to stick with what you were born with. However, force crystals in high enough concentrations would form their own natural force arts. By observing and comprehending these natural force arts, one could learn to use and evoke new forms of their elemental energies. After reaching this point in his thoughts, something in Lionel's mind clicked and he suddenly had a maddening idea he almost couldn't help but grin about. Chapter 898? Chapter 898. Could he? Lionel smiled as he rubbed Little Black Star's head. At the moment, the two were within the lab setting which had also gotten a massive upgrade. Rather than a single lab, it might as well have been an entire campus focused entirely on research and higher learning. Lionel even missed the small space and the ambience of it all, honestly. But at least there were several private rooms he could still take refuge in like this one. Little Black Star curled up within a large glass tube which had an opening that had yet to be closed. The vial of void beast blood had been inserted into a mechanism to the side. It seemed that the segmented cube practically had everything for such an event prepared. Next time I see you, you'll have become a little monster. Lionel chuckled. Yip, yip. Little Black Star's long whiskers excitedly twitched. He kept looking over to the void beast blood. If not for the fact he knew things would be easier like this, he would have already tried to swallow it whole. Clearly the little guy liked this present very much. Lionel laughed. I'll introduce you to Kira later. You'll have to thank her properly. Yip, yip. Lionel reached out a fist and Little Black Star bumped it with his little claw. Taking a deep breath, Lionel closed the opening, watching as it filled up with a dense liquid and Little Black Star fell into a peaceful sleep. Though Lionel had double, triple, even quadruple checked everything, even to the point of converting a lot of the 7th dimension force the segmented cube had remaining into 6th dimension life force for Little Black Star, he couldn't help but be worried. As a mink, Little Black Star's body was his greatest weakness. Though his talent in the dark element was even greater than Lionel's own in the light element and his evasion abilities were the greatest Lionel had ever seen, his origins would always be a limiting factor. After all, what was a little mink to all those grand and mythical creatures that existed in the dimensional verse? This void beast blood was a chance to loosen and maybe break some of those shackles. But with that came some risk. Lionel had minimized it as much as he could. The rest was up to Little Black Star. Lionel soon found himself strolling through an enormous garden. It was nothing but long stretches of green grass for as far as he could see. He assumed that it was meant to be used for growing vegetation or high-level plants, but there was obviously nothing here. Well, except for the apple cinnamon flowers Lionel had planted for Aina's sake. Soon, Lionel felt that he'd have to hop into battle again, so he chose to take the time to decompress. He also had to open the next gate of his metal synergy lineage factor before he left, so he just wanted to organize his thoughts first. Though he thought he preferred the smaller, more compact segmented cube, it was nice to be able to do this. Lionel wasn't feeling particularly down about his loss to Amory. He didn't like to lose, but losing wasn't something that caused his confidence to waver in the slightest. In fact, Amory's threats had no impact on him, and Amory's ideology had long since been thrown from his mind. Lionel didn't believe that there was anything in this world that didn't have an explanation, nothing that couldn't be broken down into nuts and bolts and analyzed piece by piece. The idea of listening or feeling a weapon was and always would be asinine to him. Lionel felt that as long as he reached a high enough level, even lineage factors would be able to be taken apart and reconstructed by him. That he was confident in. And it was because of this confidence that he had allowed this insane idea of his to proliferate to the point he couldn't get it out of his head. At this moment, Lionel felt that his snowy star lineage factor was quickly reaching the end of its rope. It was quite a funny thought to have considering he wasn't anywhere close to the sixth dimension, but it was a thought that he had nonetheless. If he had to pinpoint the weakness of this lineage factor, it wasn't in the abilities themselves, but rather in the limitation of snow force. If snow force was swapped for a more powerful or potent light elemental force, the snowy star owl lineage factor would instantly be comparable to many seventh-dimensional lineage factors. The question was, well, if Lionel was a sane, well-put-together individual, he might move on to a new idea right this moment. Messing with such a thing was beyond people, most would say. Or was it? Lineage factors had to be birthed from somewhere, right? From what Lionel understood, they could be passed down from parents, and in some rare cases, they could come from the future imprinting itself onto the past as well. Lionel had just stepped into the control level of his ability. He could now, theoretically, control his own body down to a cellular level. In addition to this, he had just gained the backing of the Phase 4 segmented cube, allowing him to convert force and form highly pure force crystals. Force crystals themselves were rare enough. But pure force crystals were rare to the point that even force crystal mines seemed ubiquitous compared to them. And yet, Lionel now had the ability to exchange a price for them. At the same time, Lionel had comprehension abilities that transcended the understanding of most, his mind putting even supercomputers to shame. So, the question was, if Lionel could pick out the perfect force to replace snow force, if he could find a force that could replicate its nourishment of the mind, its great healing, and its supreme speed, even surpassing it in all these aspects and maybe even granting the snowy star owl abilities it had never had before, could he upgrade his own lineage factor? Chapter 899. Chapter 899. Breaking down lineage factors. Lionel was absolutely fascinated by the idea, but he had so much to learn about it. How were lineage factors formed and passed along? Were they just like the DNA of humans? Or was there another method? How were lineage factors birthed? If they could come from the future, were there complex time laws to take into consideration? Or was it less about the future and more about a much higher dimension rewriting something it considered to be trivial in a lower dimension? Could lineage factors be snatched and taken? What really was the difference between abilities and lineage factors other than the fact the latter was hereditary while the former was not? The ability Steel Force Arts Lionel had run into in the Jones Zone, could they be used on lineage factors as well? Was there much of a difference to begin with? But this line of questioning also led back to what could possibly separate a lineage factor from an ability. As far as Lionel could tell, in a broad sense, lineage factors were more wildly variable than abilities were. With the exception of unique abilities like Sale and Arnold's, most if not all abilities could be documented into an ability index, separated into levels, and have their abilities described in incredible detail. However, lineage factors weren't like this at all. Some manifested like abilities, but many were so unique and variable that they were mostly kept close to the chest. This conclusion was wildly different from what Lionel had originally thought of lineage factors. Back when he was much younger, he had thought that lineage factors were simple boosts to strength, speed and the like. In fact, Lionel very clearly remembered questioning just how it could be possible to pass down affinity for a weapon from generation to generation. Such a thing baffled him. He almost hadn't believed Aina when she told him he had a spear lineage factor. However, Lionel wasn't as ignorant as he was in the past. He realized that his spear domain lineage factor wasn't giving him affinity for a weapon, it was giving him affinity for a certain kind of force that was perfect for the spear, i.e. spear force. It was a step deeper than this as well. Through his analysis, Lionel found that the spear domain lineage factor essentially rewired a portion of his forebrain for its use. This rewiring of his brain made it easier for him to digest techniques while simultaneously routing his muscle memory in such a way that it was perfectly primed for usage. If Lionel took it a step deeper, he would find it that this lineage factor not only made it easier for him to rewrite his muscle memory to take in large amounts of techniques, but it was also done in such a way that it made it particularly easy to use the spear. If one wanted to route muscle memory for a sword, one would focus on flexible fibers and fast twitch muscles. However, Lionel's was routed in a way that emphasized power and balance more. The more Lionel learned about his body, the more he realized just how scientific even the originally unknown could be. Lionel had grown to the point where he could describe the basic function of his spear domain lineage factor and why it worked so much better than Dreamscape did in learning spear techniques. However, it also made him keenly aware of just how far he was away from ever deeming to even attempt to improve such a lineage factor. Still, Lionel found it all to be fascinating. On Earth, muscle memory wasn't real paresse. It was essentially a conditioned response to something that had been practiced over and over again. But here it was quite literal. Lionel could even follow the path of his firing neurons down to their final destination. It's beautiful, Lionel thought to himself. Not only are the connections there, they only grow the more techniques I learn. However, while it happens immediately, it also works like memory. The memory of a human was fascinating. Clusters of neurons would be assigned to certain events, and a memory would become more robust the more pathways to those neurons lighting up existed. This meant something very simple. Just using his split minds to master spears wasn't enough. Lionel had to also practice and apply these. Now that Lionel thought about it, Amory had a weird habit of continuously swinging his sword even when he wasn't in battle. Each swing seemed normal, but they each had a profound truth behind it that Lionel couldn't grasp since he wasn't a swordsman. Amory's habit must have been born out of him realizing this. He lived and breathed the sword. Lionel was certain that if he could analyze Amory's body like he was doing his own, he was certain that the memory clusters, their connections, and their routes toward his muscles would be thousands of times more robust than his own. A part of that would be due to the fact Amory had had more practice. Another part would be because Amory was of a higher dimension and thus had a mind with greater capacity, and the last part would be that Amory was far more obsessive than Lionel was. What Lionel realized was that he couldn't just simulate this practice with his dream clones. Practicing in his dream world wouldn't allow the neurons a chance to fire and proceed along the paths they were meant to. He needed to form a connection between the actual movement of his muscles and his memory. It was no wonder his dreamscape was so much weaker than his spear domain lineage factor. Lionel felt that there would come a day where he could control his cells to the point that even this could be simulated by him. But, for now, with his capacity so limited, he would have to do things the old-fashioned way. Lionel became more than just a small bit fascinated about all of this. When he turned his attention to his metal synergy lineage factor, he found more points of interest. For example, his bronze runes worked like an entire organ system all to their own. It was they that both allowed Lionel's body the ability to digest and use metals to supplement his strength, almost like a cross between a digestive and circulatory system. The process of opening the gates within his body was essentially like opening the valves of a plumbing system. The more gates he opened, the more complex the bronze rune organ system would become and the more layers and power it would manifest. Of all Lionel's lineage factors, the only one he couldn't make heads or tails of was his King's Might lineage factor, at least not in a scientific sense. But, at the same time, his Snowy Star Owl lineage factor was the absolute simplest of the bunch. Chapter 900. Chapter 900. Littlest Nova. The Snowy Star Owl lineage factor was the most straightforward. It too caused a change down to the cellular level, but it was in Lionel's blood. Usually, blood was formed of plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, and finally platelets. Lionel's blood, though, had all sorts of extra oddities in it, one of which had the signature of his Snowy Star Owl lineage factor. Since Lionel didn't know what one would call it, he just called them owl cells. This nameless cell was what Lionel believed gave him the innate affinity towards snow force, and there were about 50 trillion of them in Lionel's blood. And each one of these owl cells had a special organelle within them that Lionel felt was very reminiscent of mitochondria. According to a theory from 21st century Earth, the mitochondria was formerly a bacteria absorbed by a larger eukaryotic cell. The result were the two existences gaining a codependent relationship and continuing their evolution together. Eventually, humans evolved from these ancestors, and the mitochondria is now boiled down to being the powerhouse of the cell. Obviously, Lionel's body wasn't exactly like those humans of old. After all, his lineage was technically a quarter from Earth, with the rest originating from higher dimensional worlds. The result was the insides of Lionel's body being far different from what he had learned from school, and yet surprisingly similar at the same time. This aside, his mitochondria were likely among the greatest changes, as they had no business being in a human. In fact, if Lionel had to hazard a guess, these mitochondria were likely identical to what he might find in a Snowy Star Owl. Of course, Lionel wasn't certain it was appropriate to call this organelle a mitochondria. But, after just some observation, it was indeed responsible for allowing his conversion of light elemental force into snow force. Obviously, trying to change each one of these owl cells would be foolish. If Lionel wanted to change how they worked, he would need to change the source. He would have to look into his bones. The more Lionel thought about it, the more lost he became in his own world. He felt like everything was in the palm of his hands, but he was also keenly aware of how foolish it would be to believe that things would be so simple. How many things in history sounded good in theory but were actually extraordinary mountains to climb? Lionel didn't have Aina's ability. He couldn't rely on feel. He had to comprehend everything from the ground up. He had no choice but to take things one step at a time. At the same time, though, Lionel felt that he had opened a gate, one it just might be possible for him to walk through. Lionel thought of the silver tablet. If it was possible to have a treasure that could resurrect people in this world, he didn't believe that he couldn't break down something even less fundamental than life itself into its nuts and bolts as well. Lionel took a deep breath. He had to push these matters aside for now. He wasn't quite informed enough to even attempt to do any of this. He would first need more information. In the meantime, it was about time he entered the next stage of his metal synergy lineage factor. Ichem? There's movement. In a familiar world with incense sticks as tall as mountains looming in the distance, a group of elders were alerted to movement on the family tomes. In their old age, without much hope for further advancement, some of their best entertainment came from watching these advancements take place. With the billions of Morales family members there were depicted here, there was almost always something going on. It was just that most of the time it was uninteresting, so most movement ended up being ignored. After all, who cared much about someone past their prime making a breakthrough they should have made years earlier? Oh, it's a good one. It didn't take long for the elders to realize that the movement had come from the Nova generation, causing some of them to perk up. If there were two movements that were the most entertaining to watch, it would be the oldest generation tablets and the newest generation. For the oldest generation, movement near the top of the tablet would lead to worldwide commotion. For the newest generation, the Nova generation, movement from anywhere was worth a look. It had to be remembered that names were ranked in terms of birth date before the Air Wars. Only after the Air Wars would they be ranked based on potential and strength. It wasn't long before many gazes focused on the name at the very bottom of the tome. Oh, it's the littlest Nova again? It's been how long? 3 years? A bit over that? To take that long to go from the first gate toward opening the second is a bit slow. The elders all nodded. The third and fourth dimensions were practically speed runs for talented youths. At the fastest, some would only take a few months at most. Things only began to slow down in the fifth dimension and became especially slow after stepping into the sixth. With how much drama there had been around Lionel's first breakthrough, for him to take so long was a bit disappointing indeed. But, since he was one of the heir candidates, they didn't turn their attention away. Can't be helped. How could his resources compare to the others? Humph, that stubborn brat stole the heirlooms for himself. What more resources could they need? Clearly this brat they referred to was no longer Lionel. And it was a fair point indeed. Of course, they had no idea that Lionel was basically flying blind. Plus, he was in worlds with not nearly the same force density, not to mention the fact he had waited to get the latter portions of dimensional cleanse. How long do you think it'll take? You think he will open all 9 doors this time too? That's a tough ask, don't you think? It already took 3 years to get to this point. Plus, opening up the 7th is pretty good for a first attempt at the second gate. Of course, for an elder to say pretty good, this essentially meant elite amongst elite. Only such a level was worthy of a pretty good evaluation. Ahem. That aura? What is it, Mila? That's the 5th dimension of dimensional cleanse? I'm certain. I didn't say anything the first time because everyone has the 3rd dimensional layer of dimensional cleanse, and it could be considered an excellent foundational technique. But this... The elders blinked. Not many of them used dimensional cleanse. In fact, Mila was among the very few that did. It required a deep familiarity to pick out something like that from the mere aura of a shining name. But what this observation meant was even deeper than just that. The elders looked toward one another, their eyes sparkling. What? The elders were startled awake by a shout, their heads snapping in a particular direction. What the hell is wrong with you? Have you gone senile? The elder in question didn't say a single word. Instead, he extended a wrinkled finger toward the Nova generation tablet. Chapter 901. Chapter 901. Second gate. The elders were frozen in shock. One would think that this was because of some overwhelming phenomena, maybe some flashing lights or a rare occurrence not seen in thousands of years. But this couldn't have been further from the truth. The reality could be described in a single word: nothing. That was right, nothing was happening. The flashing lights had dimmed, Lionel's aura had vanished, and the tablet had returned to its previous state. In fact, the elders were so speechless by this change that 5 minutes later, when yet another Morales family member began making a breakthrough, none of them even turned their heads in that direction. That's it? These elders weren't fools. The markers for failure were not there. At the same time, the change in Lionel's name couldn't have been clearer. He had succeeded. The issue was, why the hell was it so fast? How long had it been since he started his breakthrough? A minute? Less than that? What the hell was going on? If 3 years to prepare for a breakthrough from the first to second gate was slow, then what could opening the second gate in such a short time count as? In all their years, the elders couldn't remember ever seeing such a thing. His aura was very pure, Mila said slowly. It felt like he spent a very long time in Tier 9 of the first gate. But it also feels like this isn't enough to explain that. I have a feeling that he hasn't just awakened 1 or 2 stars of dimensional cleanse. The elders looked toward Mila. Aside from being one of the only few to practice dimensional cleanse, he also happened to have some of the sharpest senses amongst them. It had to be remembered that during Lionel's first breakthrough, the elders had even been able to see through how many cells he used to form his nodes. If it wasn't for the fact they had all been distracted when Mila said Lionel practiced dimensional cleanse, they would have been able to pick up on some of these things as well, though it wasn't an exact science. He's a madman just like his father. An elder shook his head. To enter the 5th dimension with dimensional cleanse would mean that he entered that vital star trial world at what level? The 3rd dimension? Does he have a death wish? The lips of the elders twitched. Was a shame. Had Lionel built his foundation with a different technique, he could have entered the trial world with more strength backing him. Then he might have been able to succeed in one sweep. Now, if he wanted the rest, he would have to put his life on the line. Though most only wanted the first 3 layers of dimensional cleanse, for the sake of the stars it would allow them to form, it was clear that Lionel wanted to cultivate past that point. It was hard to tell without seeing him break through whether he had gained the 6th or higher dimensional layers, but they felt that the odds were slim. He was lucky to have left with his life. This brat is always doing reckless things. If he wins the air wars, I can see years of headaches coming our way. First, Lionel opened his first gate after only forming 6 nodes. Then he entered the vital star trial world at the 3rd dimension. And now he had opened the 2nd gate in under a minute, not even allowing his body to slowly acclimate to the changes. How much pain had Lionel suffered through just from the first gate? Now he was experiencing much more pain than that all at once. If he wasn't a madman, then what was he? Despite the words of the elder, though, the group of old men and women suddenly began to laugh. They laughed so heartily that the hidden world of the Morales family began to tremble. A madman? Who of the Morales family wasn't exactly that? Contrary to what the elders thought, Lionel sat in silent meditation as though his body wasn't being carved into piece by piece. Before, this pain had truly been unbearable for him. But now, he had dream sense which allowed him to split his sensory perception between several minds. At this moment, Lionel had used 1,000 of his more than million minds to dull the pain by that factor. Of course, he could have used even more minds to make it all almost negligible, but he did not do so. Something about dulling his pain entirely made it feel like he was losing a piece of his humanity. It was a rare emotional decision for someone like Lionel who usually didn't care for such things. That said, there was another reason as well. Lionel had turned his other minds toward observing each and every aspect of his body and the changes it was undergoing. He wanted to see what changed now that he was entering the next level of his metal body, how the organ system of runes evolved, and how it might synergize, suppress or coexist with the other lineage factors of his body. Lionel had hardly realized just how easy it had been for him to open the 2nd gate. But this obviously wasn't without reason. Elder Mila was also correct in assuming that he didn't have the full picture, and it could be said that there were 2 main reasons. The first was that Lionel had formed 6 stars before even stepping into the 5th dimension. His body had been purged of its impurities to the point he was practically like a newborn baby who had immediately stepped into such a height. However, the second reason might be even more important. Not only did Lionel receive the cleansing of 6 stars, but he had also been baptized by 6th-dimensional cleansing waters. Let alone the 2nd gate, if it wasn't for the fact he had yet to bring his metal body to Tier 9 once again, he could have likely opened even the 3rd gate now. Chapter 902. Chapter 902. Contain. Lionel exhaled a long breath, the runes dancing across his skin dimming before vanishing completely. Not only had the internal runes gained far more pathways, but they had also grown thicker while simultaneously gaining some life to them. Before, Lionel's bronze runes were static and unmoving, but now they pulsed as though they had their own heart. They were truly beginning to look and act more like they had life to them, as though they really were an organ system. What was truly fascinating was that Lionel felt that his divine armor had gained an upgrade as well. It had firmly stepped into the fifth dimension, gaining a qualitative change to it. The result was something that made Lionel's gaze sparkle beside himself. Dad was right. It had to be remembered that Lionel had formed his divine armor with evolution or as its core foundation. This allowed what should have been his fourth-dimensional armor to display power far beyond its means. And now, it was displaying even more power than before, feeding off of Lionel's advancement to improve itself. At the same time, Lionel felt that his control over the spatial element had skyrocketed along with the advancement of his armor. In the past, it was difficult for him to displace himself just a single meter within a fifth-dimensional world. But, at the moment, the segmented cube space was as sturdy as a sixth-dimensional world's, and yet Lionel could still move about half a meter in any direction. Since that was the case, just how far could he move in a fifth-dimensional world? And how far would he be able to move if he activated his divine armor? Excellent. It's time. I need resources to build my metal body back up from Tier 1, and what better target than the Milky Way Guild? The situation in Valiant Heart Mountain could be said to only be getting worse day after day. Not long after Lionel's disappearance, a full-blown effort toward finding him had been put into effect. Unfortunately, how could they possibly succeed in such a thing? Lionel had entered a trial world which even had seventh-dimensional force in abundance. It was a place that those who deemed to call him enemy would never see in their lifetimes. The result of this failure was an even further suppression of Valiant Heart Mountain. It had to be remembered that Misty Woods, Crimson Hall and Rusted Blade had all been implicated by Lionel's actions. This had given Valiant Heart Mountain a small bit of breathing room. But as the three organizations panicked at their inability to find Lionel, pressure was ramped up once again on Valiant Heart. This matter hadn't happened naturally. After being punished thoroughly by the guild, it was Greta who led the charge for revenge. As a child of the frequented women, she had to scratch and claw for every merit she received. She couldn't allow herself to be passive and allow all the prestige she had worked for to crumble. The result of Greta pressing so hard were the three rival organizations of Valiant Heart Mountain beginning to press them from all directions. Their territory was eaten away at, their resources were snatched and co-opted, and they found themselves further and further on their back foot. The irony of it all was that the only thing keeping Valiant Heart afloat was Lionel's little shop. Somehow, it managed to continuously pump out treasures that allowed them to hold on, bolstering their strength and power bit by bit every day. Unfortunately, there was nothing that Greta could do about this. Let alone the fact that even the elders of Valiant Heart themselves were completely unaware of how it was they were doing this. Even if they did know, there was nothing they'd be able to do about it. The secret to the success of Lionel's Blackstar shop couldn't be found on Planet Valiant at all. The root of it all was in the Force Crafting Guild. As for why even the Milky Way Guild would be able to do nothing about this was because the Force Crafting Guild had a scope far beyond just the Milky Way. Much like Shield Cross Stars, they had establishments across all corners of the dimensional verse. The Milky Way Guild, and least of all Greta, would have no way of stopping their interaction. Lionel had no one else to thank but Jack Biennala for making him aware of the existence of the Force Crafting Guild, something that would have been the irony of all ironies to the man in question. And in addition to this, with Jack Biennala having been chased away by Lionel, the Valiant Heart organization had no choice but to rely on Lionel's small shop entirely. The trouble was that this alone wasn't enough. As quickly as Alan, Kira and the others were improving their skill with the help of Lionel's resources, they still hadn't caught up to Lionel. Even the best of them, Kira, even after Lionel had vanished for 2 years, was still only a Tier 9 black crafter. She was still a measure away from being able to craft quasi-bronze treasures and was even further from entering the ranks of fifth-dimensional crafters. This couldn't be helped. Not everyone had the perfect lineage factor, ability, not to mention a metal spirit to support their advancements in crafting. Without more help, it would be impossible for them to have progressed any more than this, and it could be said that Kira's improvement was a testament to her hidden talent. Unfortunately, fourth-dimensional treasures weren't enough to turn the tide of battle between organizations who had fifth-dimensional existences as their main backbone. At best, it was able to stall for some time. But how long would that be exactly? If Greta had anything to say about it, not long at all. At this moment, she had already laid out the plans for her first full-scale invasion of Valiant Heart Mountain and had begun to press toward the core of their territory. The space field surrounding the mostly earthen planet suddenly trembled beneath the presence of a mighty ship. The planet's magnetic field twisted and bent, its atmosphere growing volatile as an enormous kilometer-long ship descended from above. At the helm, Greta stood expressionlessly, a fiery red dress clinging to her curves. But her once delicate features were marred by a red, pulsing scar that ran from her cheek, across the bridge of her nose, and finally ended by cutting across her eyebrow, leaving a thick hairless slash through it. Though Greta's face seemed to give nothing away, the trembling of this scar seemed to contain all her rage. Chapter 903. Chapter 903, Genius Deductions. Valiant Heart Mountain instantly found itself to be under a lot of pressure. Greta hadn't moved to attack in several days, and yet she also hadn't tried to hide her presence. Whether it was the lowest worker in the organization up to the highest standing elder, there wasn't a single soul that didn't know that Valiant Heart Mountain had finally reached the end of its rope. What was especially odd was that the Oryx tribe had been quiet for several months already. This alone had made many feel like something was fishy. But, before they could learn what was happening, they landed in this situation. Within Blackstar, Kira, the twins and Rum were present. If the rest of Valiant Heart Mountain could be described to be in a panic, these four were tranquil. Even the usually reserved and panicky Lisha managed to exude the same confidence as her more boisterous younger sister, Madia. "Do you think they will really attack?" Madia asked Kira. I don't think so," Kira said after a moment of thought, her gaze still focused on the craft she was working on. Those familiar with training crafters would immediately recognize that Kira might have been drawing force arts with her quill, but she wasn't actually crafting. Rather, her target was what looked like a solid piece of wood. And yet, beads of sweat fell from her forehead with every stroke she made. This would seem simple, but it was actually a very hard substance with an irregular pattern of grain. This combination of characteristics made it especially difficult to control a crafting quill. The substance being dense and tough made things difficult enough, but the irregular grain patterns made it so that the quill tended to want to follow the path of said grains rather in the direction a force crafter wanted. The result was a perfect training tool for those who wanted to increase their skill. Oh, why not? Madia had been certain that the Milky Way Guild would eventually attack. Still, she wasn't very worried about it. Worst case scenario, they would just flash the badges they had earned from the Force Crafting Guild. Unless the circumstances were very particular, no one would harm a crafter without reason. Of course, in order to not put their lives in the hands of others, there were all sorts of other things they could do. For example, hiring a bodyguard from the guild was possible. They could also simply leave Planet Valiant for the guild as well. So, it was no wonder none of them were worried about their safety. That said, leaving the planet would be an absolute last resort precisely because the optics would be poor. Whether they liked it or not, they were still representing Lionel even now. Though outsiders didn't know it, the people of Valiant Heart did. If they failed to live up to this ideal, it would make Lionel's future plans more difficult. As far as they were concerned, Lionel was the reason they could live a life of such leisure now. They had gone from a faction no one wanted to work with to the most important crafters of the organization in just a few years. If it wasn't for Lionel so graciously sharing his crafting knowledge with them, how could they ever accomplish such a thing? Though it was impossible to tell if their resolve would hold firm even to the point of death, at least for now when their lives weren't an immediate path of harm, they had no reason to betray Lionel. "The same reason why we can't just leave," Kira replied. "The optics would be terrible. The Milky Way Guild is a guild of merchants. What is most important to merchants is profit, connections and most essentially, neutrality. If they had managed to handle things back on planet Vincero, it would have been fine. After all, that was their territory being encroached upon. They had the right to defend it. But now they're baring their teeth toward others. Whether they wanted to or not, this action suddenly reminds everyone that this friendly group of merchants they've allowed into every corner of their lives might not be so friendly anymore as long as they make one wrong move. If the Milky Way Guild really bares their fangs completely, nothing might change initially, but soon they'd find themselves slowly being suppressed in the future. It might start with a demand for higher taxes from the territories they operate in, and then it might become their operations having to be overseen in case of illegal activity, then it might become smaller merchant guilds eating up contracts they had held on to for years. It could all eventually snowball to the point the Milky Way Guild of old would be no more. Kira, you're so smart. Lisha's innocent, childlike eyes lit up. Kira coughed lightly, her crafting quill deviating from the path she had planned. Yes, of course, she said, hiding the tinge of red that colored her cheeks. It was actually Lionel who had said all of this. He had left behind an explanation of what might happen with Alan, who had passed it on to Kira. But now she was being praised for something Lionel had deduced months ago. But then why are they here if they want attack? Madia asked after a while. Well, Kira started, they're probably trying to apply pressure. Also, there are probably very few people who are certain that that ship is from the Milky Way Guild, and that's only because we have information on the ships they sent to planet Vincero. To a layman though, those ships are unmarked. If I had to take a guess as to what might happen, they plan on pushing us into a corner. When we're thoroughly suppressed, lacking in supplies and low on morale, they'll probably send in the 3 organizations to deal a decisive blow to us. Of course, they might sneak in a few elite soldiers from their personal fleet. But, by then, who will really pay attention to such a small detail? Kira coughed lightly, giving out her well-thought-out opinion eloquently and even taking some pauses to make it seem more authentic. When she saw the worshipful gaze in Lisha's eyes, she couldn't help but grin to herself. At that moment, though, Thilly came rushing in, pushing up his glasses as he hurriedly spoke. They're attacking. They sent down a first wave. Chapter 904. Chapter 904. Moping Thilly seemed to have appeared from thin air. Clearly he had just teleported into Blackstar's top floor, as they all had the right to do. Without knowing when the Milky Way Guild, or more accurately, its lackeys, would take action, some of them had been sent to continuously monitor the situation. Of course, that fell on the shoulders of the other members of the former Polished Glass faction. After all, Alan and the others, not to mention most definitely not Elther, couldn't casually stroll around Valiant City. By this point, the organization had been on high alert for a very long while. They weren't caught off guard by this sudden attack, but this didn't mean that their nerves weren't fried. Many of those tasked with the first line of defense hadn't had proper rest in weeks, and those on the back line weren't much better. A first wave? They've grown impatient, they should have waited at least another week. Kira spoke based on Lionel's analysis once again. If they had waited that long, Valiant Heart would collapse in a day or two at most. Whoever is commanding them is either pressed for time or immature. Do you know what the first wave is wearing? They seem to be a cluster from all 3 organizations. But they're all in the 4th dimension. The strongest amongst them is at the quasi-5th dimension. They're still holding back. Kira shook her head. Lionel had left behind several archetypes for what sort of commander might be leading this charge, and he had ranked them all from most dangerous to least dangerous. Or, as Kira liked to put it, smartest to dumbest. The most dangerous commander they could face was one that not only waited an extra week like Kira had expected, but said commander would also swarm Valiant Heart with its full power immediately, not holding anything back and claiming the city in one sweep. As for the least dangerous and dumbest commander, they would not only be impatient, but they would also be wishy-washy in their impatience, choosing to balance their early attack with probing strikes. In Lionel's opinion, such a commander was a fool. Sending out probing strikes would give their enemy a chance to solidify and reaffirm their resolve. Without sending out a group that could immediately crush them, you would allow the light of hope to burn. By the time your enemy realized they should be despairing, you would have suffered casualties just as great as they did. Of course, these were all based on Lionel's simulations that were only growing better and more accurate by the day. And this was only one thing to consider. The commander was Greta, she was the one directing the 3 organizations. As such, not only did she not care about casualties, the more of them they suffered, the better. The importance of a merchant guild's neutrality wasn't lost on her. In Greta's mind, she was killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Not only would she take out an enemy, but she would also weaken 4 organizations who had seen their teeth being bared. Wasn't this the perfect result? Unfortunately for Greta, Lionel still thought she was a fool. Though her actions would indeed weaken the 3 organizations, she had not only missed a golden opportunity, but she had brought the Milky Way Guild back to square one. Those observing this battle from the sidelines weren't fools. They knew who the mastermind behind it all was. They could turn a blind eye to it if it was just the Milky Way Guild observing things, but if it was the Milky Way Guild forcing 4 organizations to suffer such resounding losses, what was the difference between this and the Milky Way Guild acting personally? Of course, there was still a small difference, and the guild might have slightly more leeway taking this action. But it would still result in some pushback the guild would have to take delicate steps to resolve. And it was all caused by Greta outsmarting herself. What even Lionel didn't know, though, was that Greta wouldn't usually be so foggy-minded despite her abrasive personality. She hadn't climbed out a heap of Augustus children just because of her fists, she had her mind as well. The trouble was just a couple months ago, after suffering a terrible punishment from the guild, she was finally sent out on another mission. During this mission, though, she suffered another resounding loss, this time at the hands of a troop of oryx, creatures she had never personally laid eyes on before. The result of that loss was the scar that now ran down her face. Even now it continued to throb, filling her with an endless rage. After suffering 2 losses back to back, Greta was on the verge of collapsing. She didn't care about the future of the guild, she just needed results right now, no matter what the cost. Even if the guild suffered pushback later, it would still be difficult to pin all the blame on her. This win. She needed it. She had crawled up so far through a bed of needles. She refused to cough back up the rewards of her labor so easily. Should we go and fight? Rum suddenly spoke up for the first time, his large frame sitting up. Though he was so massive he was basically an enormous teddy bear. Let alone fighting, he didn't even like to raise his voice. No. We've done our job as force crafters. All the frontline men and women are equipped with the best we can give them. How long they survive is up to them. Kira said with a heavy tone. The group fell into silence. In truth, they all had complicated emotions. Somewhere deep inside, they knew that Valiant Heart Mountain was finished even as the first wave charged up the mountain pass. It was hard to tell how they should feel. Before Lionel, they had experienced nothing but bullying at the hands of the Valiant Heart system. But it had still been their home for several decades. Should they rejoice? Or should they feel sad? What are you all moping around for? The sudden voice cut through all their thoughts. Lionel? Chapter 905. Chapter 905. Resolve. Lionel suddenly appeared amongst them all, a casual smile on his face. But the instant he did, the members of Polished Glass felt like prostrating themselves, their very souls trembling in his presence. They couldn't wrap their heads around what they were feeling for a long time until Kira's eyes suddenly widened, a shocking realization hitting her. You're not in the 3rd dimension anymore. The shock sunk in for them all at once. They were so used to Lionel doing ridiculous things that they had completely forgotten that he was an entire dimension below them. Now that he was suddenly a dimension above them, it felt like they were in the presence of a god. Despite the fact Lionel's clothing couldn't have been more casual, even down to the sneakers on his feet, they still felt like they should be worshipping him. All right. Lionel grinned. I broke through. That's why I had to leave for such a long time. The next pieces of the technique I practice require passing a trial to get to. Kira suddenly felt itchy all over. Lionel's strength was already so ridiculous in the 3rd dimension. He had even managed to run from a building filled with 5th-dimensional existences. Of course, they hadn't been prepared for his sudden murder of their young heiress, or else it wouldn't have been so simple. But the fact still stood. Now that Lionel was in the 4th. No. Kira's eyes widened. You're not in the 4th dimension. Kira gulped. Taking 8 or 9 months to cross an entire dimension. What kind of monster was he? Lionel had already told them all that he was from a family in the 7th dimension. He didn't seem to care about hiding massive matters most others would keep close to their chest. And that was especially so when he was around his own people. This was all to say that Kira knew that he would be a monster. But wasn't this too exaggerated? Of course, if she knew that the Morales family still thought he was slow, she wouldn't know where to bow her head in shame. Let's forget about those little details. They're attacking, right? I can feel it. Lionel's affinity for the earth was on another level. In fact, he directly took off his sneakers even as he spoke, feeling the diamond-etched flooring beneath his feet. In that instant he felt as though he could feel the vibrations throughout the whole of the planet. If he coupled this with the now ridiculous range of his internal sight, hardly anything would escape his notice, even if it occurred hundreds of miles from him. Dash? Yes, they're attacking. But there's no one of the 5th dimension. Lionel's lip curled. So the least dangerous commander, huh? Kira grinned mischievously, nodding in agreement. Then we can have a little bit of fun. But... Kira hesitated. I know what you want to say. I'm no longer in the 4th dimension, so my going out will force their hand, right? Not just that, but you're also the one they're looking for. If you go out, they'll ignore everything else and just target you. Lionel chuckled. That was a fair point. He was so excited to jump into battle again he had almost neglected this. He could already hear his blood rushing and his heart pumping. Also, Lionel, what is your goal exactly? If you say Valiant Heart, then what? Philly suddenly spoke up, his eyes flickering nervously behind his glasses. Unlike Alan, it seemed that Philly really did need his glasses. Lionel hadn't been able to tell before, but now it caught his attention, making him quite curious. He'll be giving this planet to the Oryx. Lionel spoke without hesitation. As for Valiant Heart Mountain as presently constructed, they have reached the end of their road. The room fell into silence. As for Lionel, his eyes narrowed. The first clash had begun. Through his feet and his internal sight, Lionel's gaze was practically transported dozens of kilometers away. As though he was right there, he watched the first clash happen. The first spurt of blood, the first clang of two weapons, the first mournful cry. The reason Lionel hesitated wasn't because he was worried about his safety. It would take a lot to threaten his life right now. What he was worried about was the implications it would have for Valiant Heart Mountain. By now, Shield Cross Stars had definitely heard of these events. So, if he appeared now, not only would the Milky Way Guild think the organization had been harboring him, but Shield Cross Stars would likely also begin to target them in an above-board manner for colluding with a fugitive. But Philly's question had put everything into perspective for him. He had already decided that Valiant Heart Mountain couldn't exist anymore. In fact, the pressure that would be applied by both the Guild and Shield Cross Stars would make it even easier for the Oryx to take this planet. I'll have to apologize to Sail when I get the chance. Hopefully she won't hate me too much. After all, I owe her a favor for removing the slave brand from my forehead. Lionel bent down, rolling up his sweats until both legs rested at his calves. His palm flipped over, revealing a simple wooden spear. It seemed pristinely crafted, but there wasn't an ounce of a special aura coming from it or its blade. You guys head to the Force Crafting Guild. After I am done here, I will go meet up with you. Leave the treasures in the shop behind, they can consider it as a final farewell gift. Without another word, Lionel vanished. When he appeared again, he stood so high in the skies that he was nothing but a faint dot to most. His aura spread out, a rumbling might shaking the battlefield as though to alert them all of the presence. A warlord of the battlefield had come, and his purpose was singular. Then Lionel began to fall. Chapter 906. Chapter 906. Apology. On the ground below, the blue belt-wearing seniors had taken up the vanguard. Those that were left were absolutely loyal to Valiant Heart, and surprisingly both Hephaestus and Raylion were present. With their talent, most organizations would accept them. In fact, many of the blue belt seniors had long since found reasons for leave. Whether it was to visit their families after such a long time or to go out on an adventure, and sometimes it was completely without reason, many of them slipped away. However, maybe the two men Lionel hated the most were still here, holding down the front line. The former brandished his two daggers with ever-growing ferocity. The latter made a 10-meter radius around him an absolute death zone. Anyone who stepped foot into his range was crushed into minced meat without warning. To their side, Sail flourished as well, the petals and vines of her unique constitution taking on the role of both offense and defense, not to mention giving them an even greater advantage in terrain. Not only did the Valiant Heart army hold the advantage of high ground as they defended the mountain pass, with the help of Sail's vines, the smooth terrain had become treacherous to cross. The combination of these three geniuses made it feel like they had a chance. But there was only so much they could do. Valiant Heart was completely outnumbered. Though the impact of those three was quite large, there was only so much of the battlefield that they could cover for. And, without the support of other geniuses like Lionel or Aina who hadn't appeared in almost a year now, they were all the organization had. Since their enemies hadn't sent out fifth-dimensional existences, this became a tacit agreement that such powerhouses wouldn't participate just yet. This was their best chance to make an impact with their strength, so they had to go all out. But how much could they do as three against an army of tens of thousands? Among which were geniuses just as great as them. At that moment, Rafthin of Rusted Blade, Wisan of Misty Woods, and Emna of Crimson Hall all made their presences known, charging for Raylion, Sail and Hephaestus. The instant the latter three were occupied, a slaughter would commence. They all knew this well. Rafthin grinned wildly, sending Emna a wink as he brandished his massive 3-meter-long rusted blade. Come die. His boisterous laughter filled the skies as he prepared to swing. But it was at that exact moment that a suffocating aura suddenly pressed down upon the battlefield. The expressions of everyone changed, especially those of the elders observing things from the side of Valiant Heart and the three organizations. No fifth-dimensional existences were supposed to take action yet. What was going on? Each side thought the other had shamelessly duped them and prepared to rush out. But what they saw next left them completely stunned. their hearts shuddering. Lionel fell down from the skies, his expression indifferent as his sweats rustled through the whistling wind. He seemed completely at ease. The closer he got, the more suffocating his aura became. Bang! As loud as the sound of his landing was, it wasn't nearly loud enough. To fall from several kilometers up in the sky and to barely cause the earth to tremble was a feat that made little to no sense. In fact, Lionel's knees hardly bent on impact. One would have thought that he had been standing there the entire time. In an instant, he had appeared at the dividing line between two armies, his right hand casually swinging his spear in what seemed to be a more and more refined arc. It took no more than a moment for most to recognize Lionel. The spear, that light violet hair, that bronze skin. It was undeniable. But as soon as they realized this, the reactions were vastly different. One side couldn't believe he had appeared while the other was caught in the excitement he had crossed with the shock he felt so imposing now. Rafthin, who had raised his blade to attack already, narrowed his gaze, a sinister light flashing within their depths. Before, he had lost to Lionel handily, but he couldn't display even a tenth of his power. He felt like he had been suppressed from all angles and he couldn't manage to get a foothold anywhere. But now they were on solid ground, not those ridiculous waving pillars. The power he could display now was like night and day. After just a moment's delay, Rafthin shot forward, the aura of his blade rising again and against as the manifestations of his Four Seasons realm comprehension rose into the skies. On one side there was a blazing heat. On the other there was a treacherous cold. They wrapped around one another, threatening to implode in a cacophonic boom. Lionel, you shouldn't have appeared here. Sale's voice was caught between anxiousness, anxiety and a shrill disbelief. Lionel sighed and looked back towards Sale. I'm sorry about this. Sale was stunned by Lionel's words, her expression warping. What was that supposed to mean? Her mind was too befuddled to come up with a conclusion immediately. And by the time she was on the precipice, she suddenly noticed Rafthin's actions. Watch out. Lionel shook his head, seemingly still lost in his apology. It really was hard for him to cross Sale like this. Though he had reprimanded her almost a year earlier for expecting him to help an organization that didn't want to help itself, that didn't mean he wouldn't feel bad doing what he was about to do. Or rather what he had already done. But there was no changing that now. At that moment, Rafthin had appeared before Lionel, his long blade raised high in the air. Getting distracted on a battlefield? Rafthin released all his resentment. Because of Lionel, he had to spend months recovering from his wounds. The result was his progression slowing by several measures, all because of this bastard. Sale didn't even get a chance to reach out a helping hand. Just as she was about to go all out, the casual arc of Lionel's wooden spear suddenly shifted completely. Rafthin's roar was caught in his throat, his eyes widened in shock even as he suddenly found himself staring at a headless corpse. His headless corpse. With a single blow, Lionel had felled a genius of the Rusted Blade organization. He turned to face the remainder of the army, his aura steadily growing the point they felt their knees go weak. Without Lionel raising a finger, they began to collapse one after another, the resolve in their hearts shattering. Chapter 907. Chapter 907. Shrill cry. Lionel's aura continued to rise as one group after another fell to their knees. It felt like no matter how hard they tried, there was simply nothing they could do before His Majesty. They could only watch in horror as the head of a genius spun through the air before landing on the ground with a dull plop. Let alone the enemy organizations, even those to Lionel's back were in shock. It wasn't just that he dared to appear here, but also that he had taken just a single strike to deal with Rafthin, who had just moments ago displayed a strength that made them all shiver. Wuxia's chubby cheeks trembled. The moment he saw Lionel attack, he felt the threat of death force the hair on the back of his head to stand tall. Out of reflex, he formed as many shields as he could in the blink of an eye and shot backward. However, even then his knees continued to tremble, a deep fear taking root in his heart. Emna clutched two daggers so forcefully that despite her palms never having touched the blade, blood still began to fall from them. Her senses were even sharper than Wuxian and Rafthin's. After Lionel appeared, she didn't move a single inch because she felt that it wouldn't make a difference. Whether she was 1 meter away or 100, it would only take a single thought for her to die. The only way for her to have preserved her life on this day was to not have stepped onto the battlefield at all. Of course, Emna was also smart enough to know that Lionel's appearance here was like a death sentence to Valiant Heart. But who cared? She would be dead by then. Why should she care about her organization ultimately winning in the end? How dare you? Rage-filled roars rose up from the backline of the three organizations. Their auras surged forward, trying to dispel Lionel's hold on their armies, but it was to no avail. Lionel's foot rose. The clear movement of his toes, the glimpse of his soul, and the casual flex of his ankle made his actions seem as mundane as they could. And yet, by the time his foot touched the ground once more, he had vanished, appearing before Wuxian, who was just a moment away from pissing his pants. The swing of Lionel's spear seemed slow. Every half a foot it moved in an arc left behind another clear image, harmonizing with the light elemental force in the surroundings. Lionel had found that practicing the swing of his spear while activating harmonic spear caused the nerves that made up his spear domain lineage factor to fire multiple times for just a single swing. The result was a single swing being worth up to 10 or even more depending on the afterimages he produced. He found it to be fascinating. The act of mapping out exactly the position his body had been to relay it to harmonic spear, and thus leave a cloned afterimage in the air, was actually helping him to train. It seemed that this low-level technique would have to follow him for a while. PCHU. Wuxian's energy shields were sliced through like partially melted butter. He didn't stand a chance before he too found himself looking at his headless corpse. However, unlike Raf Thin, he had been aware that he was about to die from start to finish. The result was him being forced to watch as a moist patch spread across the crotch of his corpse. He died. Humiliated. At that moment, the enraged auras of the elders of the three organizations charged through the army. It seemed that none of them had the ability to fly, so they could only take large leaps forward, crossing hundreds of meters at a time with fury lighting their gazes. Dash? Among them was the elder from Rusted Blade with the exaggeratedly large greatsword that had previously made Lionel chuckle, the old woman with a foot in the grave from Crimson Hall, and finally the silent old man from Misty Woods. Even the silent old man couldn't seem to hold back his rage. He stared at Lionel with a brewing storm threatening to leap from his chest. They had never thought that such a thing would have happened right at the start of the battle. There was supposed to be a tacit agreement against such things, and yet here was Valiant Heart breaking those rules. But, when they saw Lionel's face, they suddenly understood that his appearance couldn't have possibly been related to Valiant Heart. Sending him out, especially when the battle had just begun and they weren't anywhere near being in dire straits, was foolish to an extreme. It was like nailing their own coffin. The fact that Lionel had come out of his own volition was obvious to anyone with half a brain. However, why would they give up this opportunity by admitting such a thing? Valiant Heart. The shrill cry of the old woman shook the skies. My Crimson Hall won't rest until only one of us remains. Such a shameless organization has no right to exist. Valiant? What exactly is valiant about? Why? The old woman's shrieks were suddenly cut off as she rapidly moved to the side, horror painting her face. In one moment she looked perfectly fine. In the next, her arm flew into the air, flipping continuously amidst a fountain of blood. It looked oddly poetic. Lionel shook his head. He should have been able to kill her with one stroke. The power gap between them was enormous. And yet, he was only able to take an arm. Granted, he hadn't activated his spear domain lineage factor and was only using a single neuron at a time. But he shouldn't have to go so far against such a weak opponent. He needed more practice. You. The old woman froze. In the next moment, a thin line of red appeared at her forehead and quickly grew. Before the stunned eyes of those watching, she was suddenly split into two, falling to the ground in two gory halves. Chapter 908. Chapter 908. Good time. The silent old man and the Rusted Blade elder were stunned. Their raging blood suddenly iced over, whatever momentum they had dying out like the last embers of a fire. Lionel had no idea why the old woman had been the most enraged of them. After all, her genius, Emna, was the only one that Lionel hadn't killed. Of course, that was because Lionel still wanted to recruit Emna, but that was beside the point. The fact she was still so shrill and annoying despite the fact her Crimson Hall had suffered the least was enough to prove that they had already latched onto Valiant Heart's weakness and were prepared to eradicate them for Lionel's appearance. This much Lionel had already expected, but he still found it annoying that they would bloviate about having the high moral ground so grandly. So he decided to kill her first. Plus, what got to Lionel the most was the mantra of Crimson Hall. They were an organization that loved blood and murder. They even taught their disciples that there was nothing more important. And yet here was their leader, shrieking over the death of warriors who had come to a battlefield. It was ridiculous. By now, there wasn't a single soul who didn't know Lionel was in the fifth dimension. It was hard to tell because he couldn't be quite considered to have firmly stepped into Tier 1, but his battle prowess was more than enough to force the elders to ignore this small difference. To become an official elder of a bronze organization at their level, one needed to enter Tier 1. The organization heads like the shrill old lady and Hutchin of Valiant Heart would be either Tier 2 or 3. As for the mysterious protector elders that had followed them to the competition on planet Vincero, they would be Tier 4. Much like in the third and fourth dimensions, every 3 tiers resulted in a large watershed, causing the gap between Tier 3 and Tier 4 to be quite large. This gap was enough for these old men and women to become the trump cards of a bronze organization. However, what these numbers also showed was that Valiant Heart, Rusted Blade and the other 2 organizations were at the bottom of the barrel in terms of bronze organizations. They most definitely couldn't be compared to the Milky Way Guild, which stood amongst the peak of bronze organizations, having a quasi-6th dimension existence as their head. Knowing this now, it was no wonder the 2 heads were frozen into silence. A Tier 3 expert had been killed with just 2 swings. Didn't that mean that Lionel already had the ability to single-handedly eradicate their organizations? The head of Rusted Blade took a step back, slowly communicating with his 4-meter-long great sword. For the first time in his life he regretted just how enormous his weapon was. Why was it taking so long to enter his palm? The silent head of Misty Woods released his aura, shattering his shoes into scattered fluttering pieces of leather and fabric. His toes dug into the soil of the mountain pass, a strong surge of wood elemental force pervading the surroundings as he kept his nerves tight and primed. Tier 4. Surprisingly, the head of Misty Woods was already at the level of a mysterious elder. Clearly, he had kept this card close to his vest until now because even the head of Rusted Blade was stunned. Of course, it wasn't that Lionel couldn't have pried into the secret previously, it was that there was simply no point until just now. Who knows, maybe the gap between Tier 3 and 4 would be large enough to make this interesting. If you are doing this for your friends, I can tell you that they've already returned to Earth. Lionel blinked when the usually silent old man spoke. Was he trying to get him to give up? What a sly old man. If he left now, Valiant Heart would still be labeled as traitorous and it would only make it easier for them to take down. It seems the head of Misty Woods thought that Lionel was worried about his friends, so he took this risk. The reality was that Lionel already knew his brother's return to Earth. It couldn't have been more perfect timing. By now, Earth should have already entered the 5th dimension. Its speed was shocking to many indeed. Lionel simply smiled in response. Let's fight. Lionel shot forward, his figure leaving afterimages in its wake. In that same instant, a tsunami of tree roots surged out of the ground, causing Lionel's brows to raise. The power of this move was not small. Surrounded by forest from all sides, it seemed that the head of Misty Woods wasn't a pushover. Dash? The head of Rusted Blade finally got his blade into his hands, his aura flourishing. His gaze locked onto Lionel, his mind filled with murderous thoughts and intentions as universal force began to formulate around him. Lionel suddenly found himself dashing through a death trap of thick trees, roots and branches. Sometimes he was right side up, but he often found himself running sideways and upside down just to dodge out of the next vice trap. Lionel quickly realized, though, that the head of Misty Woods' goal wasn't to immediately kill him. He was changing the terrain to make the battlefield as beneficial to himself as possible. It was clear that compared to the shrill old woman and the head of Rusted Blade, this old man knew how to use his head. The head of Misty Woods took a deep breath as scales of bark began to cover him from head to toe. An ancient, wizened aura exuded from him as his strength and momentum continued to grow. He rose his palms before him and turned them to face the sky, angling them at a 45-degree angle to make it seem as though he was holding a large book with pages twice the size of his head. At that moment, Lionel's pupils constricted as he felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Today would be the day he met his first religion of the dimensional verse. It was most definitely not going to be a good time. O goddess of the evergreen, hear my call. Chapter 909. Chapter 909, Time and Energy. Lionel had never sensed before pervaded the air. If he had to describe it, he would say that it felt as though world force and universal force had fused into an all-new sort of force that suddenly gave this head before him, who was already going to be slightly difficult to deal with, even more strength to work with. The trouble with Lionel's current level was that he had yet to create or learn fifth-dimensional techniques that could supplement his raw strength. The only exception to this was star fusion, but he couldn't very well take out his trump card for this battle, right? Now with the head suddenly bringing out his full power, feeling the threat of Lionel, this would be troublesome indeed. At that moment, the countless layers of wooden vines around Lionel suddenly began to rise up and fuse into one. The odd force grew into a tempest, even faintly suppressing Lionel's own aura to the point he couldn't help but narrow his eyes. In one moment, Lionel was jumping through an obstacle course of tree roots. In the next, a large palm formed of wood suddenly blotted out the sky. It was 10 meters from palm to tip and was constructed of numerous overlapping vines. Just the momentum of its downward swing alone made it feel as though the air around Lionel was solidifying, the harsh whistling and whining grating on the ears. It felt to anyone observing that the moment the palm fell, everything beneath it would be eradicated. But what was most shocking to Lionel was that he found his force being restricted as though he had suddenly stepped into a higher dimensional world. Even his spatial force didn't seem to want to allow him to dodge out of the way. How could Lionel not be shocked? He had never heard of such a force before, and he had definitely not expected someone like the head of Misty Woods to have access to it. The head continues to hold out his palms, his face the picture of piety and reverence. It was like he could almost feel his goddess embracing him, like he could sense the touch of her lips to his forehead. For her, he would do anything. Lionel found his ankles bound and his wooden spear refused to listen to him. It was clear that his spear preferred to listen to the call of the wood elemental force around it rather than Lionel himself. Lionel shook his head. He had a feeling that if it was Amory, even a seventh-dimensional wood elemental force user wouldn't be able to make his sword react like this. Lionel's spear couldn't have been more common. With a simple knife he could easily carve one far better. But Lionel still felt like this was true. It might be in the way I use spear force. Is it just a blade for sharpening? Or is it more than that? If it's just a blade, what would be different between different weapon forces? Wouldn't they all be the same? Lionel felt like he had grasped onto something. His dreamscape began sparking, but what was especially curious was the fact the sparks were trying to connect his spear force, his mage arts, and the head of Misty Woods' odd force? What could possibly link these? Seeing that Lionel was actually absent-minded in battle, the people of Valiant Heart panicked. By this point, the palm was only 5 meters above Lionel's head. Depending on the angle, it seemed that he had already been engulfed. There was already nowhere to run. Lionel's clothing fluttered wildly beneath the pressure, his hair almost threatening to fly from his scalp. Even keeping his eyes open at this moment was a difficult task as hurricane-force winds whipped about with impunity. Lionel finally looked upward, a calm expression on his face. For a moment, the winds around him settled down as though they couldn't move in his presence. Meteoric impact. Lionel sent out a simple piercing strike upward, its image layering several times over. The instant his spear blade met the palm of wood, the world went silent for a moment. And then it all imploded. Bang. A tempest of raging flames shot into the air like a crimson cone. It blasted a hole through the palm so wide that Lionel's figure was completely unharmed when the rest of it descended. Lionel's sudden burst of fire elemental force was so massive that all the water vapor in the air vanished in an instant. The temperature skyrocketed, the air became dry, and the skin of those in the surrounding began to crackle and redden. Flames licked across the head of Misty Woods' technique, threatening to burn an entire forest of trees along with it. At that moment, the head of Rusted Blade appeared before Lionel, his 4-meter-long blade descending from the skies with every intention of severing everything in its path. Despite having blade in their title, the men and women of Rusted Blade all used blunt weapons. Their mantra focused on power. They didn't care if their edge was dulled by rust, their strength alone was supreme. The head was a veteran of battle. He had chosen the instant Lionel released a devastating attack to make his move, believing that the latter wouldn't be able to release another so powerful in a short time. His action would also give the Misty Woods head a chance to regroup and form an even more powerful attack. Unfortunately, he had no way of knowing that Lionel saw meteoric impact as a foundational skill to his combat style. Meaning, it was his least taxing technique and the one he would use the most often. A powerful attack. Sure, maybe to him. But to Lionel. Vanishing blade. Lionel stabbed out his spear at empty air. Before the head could even be happy that it seemed his guess was correct, he felt a splitting pain at his forehead. Just like that, before he could even cross the last 100-meter distance between himself and Lionel, and even before he could get a clear view of Lionel's face through all the branches and roots, his life was snuffed out. Lionel, though, was shaking his head. He hadn't wanted to use techniques in this battle, but he had already been forced to. It seemed he had a long way to go. The head of Rusted Blade's sacrifice had done something, though. It didn't buy a lot of time, but just a small bit of breathing room was all the silent old man needed. His aura was pushed to a new level and Lionel's flames were snuffed out in a single breath. Chapter 9-10. Chapter 9-10. Familiar feeling. Lionel's eyes narrowed. He felt that mysterious energy snuff out his flames much like it had suppressed his other forces previously. Wood should naturally had a weakness to fire, but it seemed that whatever this mysterious force was had the ability to counteract this weakness to a small extent. What Lionel saw next, though, left him baffled. A lotus began to form amidst the winding wooden structures. But it was completely unlike any lotus Lionel had ever seen or read about before. This lotus was constructed entirely of arms and hands. They overlapped over one another to form petal-like structures, each layer exuding a more and more powerful aura. Although the head of Misty Woods seemed to only be capable of forming 3 of these layers, it was more than enough to display his might to an almost heavenly degree. The skies trembled, the earth shook, and the density of wood elemental force only seemed to grow exponentially with each passing moment. After a few breaths, it felt less like his forces were being suppressed and more like there was simply no other forces to call upon to begin with. The lotus of arms and hands began to rotate, the piety in the head's face only growing as he closed his eyes, feeling the world around him through his countless roots and branches. It was like the death of his comrade meant nothing to him, all there was in his mind was his goddess. Nothing more and most definitely not anything less. It was hard to tell if he wanted to prostrate himself before this invisible goddess or if he wanted to worship the lotus itself. But those worshippers of the evergreen goddess had a hard time distinguishing between the two. The evergreen lotus was the symbol of their goddess. It was their privilege to be able to use even a portion of its power like this. They were blessed beyond belief and gratefulness overflowed in their hearts. To kill the enemies of the evergreen goddess, that was their duty. Die. A roar left the lips of the silent old man. He seemed to have changed into a completely different person. The bark that covered his skin became an ink-black color. His irises were painted over in an unnatural, almost poisonous sort of green. He bared his teeth, their pearly white sparkling amidst the contrast of black and harsh green. At that moment, his murderous intent even made those of Crimson Hall bow out in inferiority. The rotating lotus of arms and hands suddenly began to lash out. Each whipping palm was more furious than the last, leaving cracks of thunder and shattering sound barriers in their wake as they cratered the ground beneath Lionel's feet. Without even touching the ground, the wind pressure of the palms alone made it feel like meteors were falling from the sky. The earth exploded apart, mushroom clouds of dirt and rock shooting upward and showering the battlefield in a fog of brown. Even as he rolled and dodged for his life, Lionel couldn't help but be astonished. He could tell that the power of these palm strikes was beyond just the wood element alone. It wasn't that a powerful enough wood elemental expert couldn't create such an effect, but rather that the head of Misty Woods' organization wasn't using enough raw force to cause such devastation. There was something else hidden within, a secret Lionel felt stemmed from the palms themselves that held a mysterious power. Lionel felt that it was related to that mysterious force that seemed to be a cross of world force and universal force. But he simultaneously felt that it was a layer even deeper than that. O goddess of the evergreen, shower your blessings down upon me so that I might cleanse the world of a scourge. The aura only seemed to grow. The longer the usually silent old man held his palms upward, the longer his prayer lasted, the more powerful he seemed to become. Lionel's pupils constricted. The lotus of arms and hands was originally a gorgeous shade of brown, a beautiful grain of wood that woodworkers would give an arm and a leg to work with. But now it suddenly became even more so, gaining vein patterns of gold that reminded Lionel a lot of his bronze runes. The instant these veins appeared, the aura of the lotus of arms and hands skyrocketed, their strength more than just doubling in a single breath. A palm shot out with such blazing speed that Lionel's knees bent beneath the wind pressure before he managed to dodge out of the way. Bang! An abyssal hole of at least 20 meters deep was excavated in the blink of an eye. Yet, the palm had already retracted, shooting forward in 2s, 3s and even 4s as the aura of the lotus continued to climb. Infernal cyclone. Ada Ol Lionel's spear began to spin in his hands, causing wheels of fire to jet outward, rolling through the ground and slicing through the air as they took out one arm after another. I have to end this. Lionel sighed. He realized that battling like this really wasn't his style. He was relying a lot on skill and technique, not to mention raw strength as opposed to his mind. If he was using his ability like he usually did, this battle would have ended dozens of exchanges ago. He needed to find a balance. But, right now, he couldn't afford to get embroiled in a battle that might injure him and also drain his stamina. After all, he had enemies closing in from all sides right now. It would be foolish to continue like this. I have to thank you for opening up a new world to me now. I think I understand how to progress my universal force after so long. Lionel stopped holding back, his gaze suddenly turning a deathly shade of cold. The entire world reflected in his mind. If he wanted, he could envelop the whole planet in his senses. Lionel's steps flickered, his body vanishing and reappearing as it weaved in and out of sweeping roots. In the midst of prayer, the silent old man was shocked to find Lionel suddenly before him, holding a spear that had gone through his chest. And yet, he couldn't understand how Lionel had done so while standing more than 20 meters from him. Vanishing blade. Lionel retracted his spear, his head tilting up to the skies as the jungle of wooden vines collapsed all around him. Were they finally going to take action now? Suddenly, Lionel's expression changed. This feeling. It was the same as when Shield Cross Stars branded him with a slave mark. His head snapped toward the head's corpse, the latter's face still etched with an endless piety. It's coming from there. Shit. Chapter 9:11. Chapter 9:11. Furious, the temperature around Lionel dropped by several measures. A shocking feat considering tongues of fire were still nipping around the battlefield in him. But this was simply the representation of how much rage he was feeling. Lionel had never truly gotten a chance to vent out what had happened to him almost 3 years ago now, but that didn't mean that he had gotten over it. He usually wore a charismatic smile and had a carefree attitude, but that only hid a deep-rooted pride that he didn't often show, a pride that had been encroached upon in this way once before, and a pride he refused to allow to be encroached upon again in this very same way. The moment Lionel sensed the change, he reacted, shooting backward as his gaze became frightening. He didn't need to think very much to understand what was going on. With all the prayers that the head of Misty Woods had been so pious and chanting, it didn't take a genius to understand that he was a very religiously devout man. It also wasn't that much of a leap for Lionel to conclude that his strength and that odd, mysterious force also came from his worship. For someone like Lionel, he might not have believed in a god back when he was on third-dimensional Earth. But he was also a person who was very flexible when presented with new information. He wasn't stubborn to a fault. In fact, he could very easily accept new theories with solid proof behind them. Since he was aware that there was higher dimensional beings far greater than himself and he could see how the head's prayer led to an increase in his strength, was it that great of a leap to accept that gods and goddesses, or at least what lower dimensional beings would perceive as gods and goddesses, did exist? And, in the case that such a being existed, it also wouldn't be too large of a leap to believe that they got something out of people worshipping them, not much different from how Lionel's kings might grew stronger the more subordinates he had. In fact, it was quite eerily similar in that way. Having reached a conclusion up to here, what would a god that lost a devout follower do? Shouldn't there be some sort of punishment so that no one dared to casually target their people? By this point, everything made sense. Clearly, Lionel was being targeted for having killed a follower of this evergreen goddess. In fact, he was precisely being punished because the man in question, Asenjover, was deeply involved to the religion to the point where he had become a titled member. This so-called title differed depending on the religion. But the label of titled member was the same across all of them. Simply put, they were individuals who had enough belief to gain some small favor from their god or goddess. However, understanding this didn't lessen Lionel's fury in the slightest. In fact, it only made his rage all the more palpable. What was the underlying meaning of this action? Wasn't it that the followers of this religion could kill as they pleased and those without a god or goddess to protect them could only accept whatever punishment such a person deemed them deserving of? What kind of bullshit was that? Lionel's pupils flickered with red. If this seal was on the same level as the one Shield Cross Stars had put on him, it would have only been a matter of a thought to obliterate it. After all, the current Lionel was so far beyond that previous sale and strength that it would be child's play. But clearly this one was on a completely different level. Lionel could tell that not only would it brand him, but it would even weaken him like a curse. The sight of Lionel shooting back and dodging air was a shocking one for many to behold. Most here weren't even qualified to sense what was chasing Lionel. In fact, any member of the Evergreen religion or church would be shocked at Lionel's mere reaction to it, let alone the fact he was actually still dodging it. Fuck off. Lionel's roar shook the skies. He pointed his finger forward at what seemed like empty air, his gaze alight with a furious crimson. At that moment, a beautiful light of twisting golden red appeared. Those that saw it initially felt it was among the most gorgeous colors they had ever seen. Something about it seemed otherworldly and transcendental. But in the blink of an eye, that fascination turned to horror. A fear the likes of which rose up from the very depths of their hearts took hold. It was a kind of instinctual fear. Like one a child would have to the dark or prey would have toward its predator. This energy felt like it was meant to take hold and destroy the world. Everything in its path turned to ash. Bang! The energy exploded, clashing with the air before blasting through in the next moment. It tore into the ground and incinerated a line down the army of the three organizations. Anyone touched by this force was left without a body. Anyone even near it burst from the inside out, every ounce of liquid in their body vaporizing in an instant. The world fell into silence. A moment later, all that was left was a certain young man heaving out deep breaths, his gasps radiating out with a black fog that seemed to originate from his inner organs. Lionel had suddenly gone from a man who finished a battle with 3 fifth-dimensional existences without breaking a sweat to a mortal man who looked like he had just finished running a marathon. If marathons also charred your inner organs black, that is. It was safe to say that Lionel was furious even now. He shouldn't have been pushed so far just to deal with something like this. Planet Valiant began to rumble. The line Lionel had cut through the earth bubbled forth with waves of lava that seemed to originate from its core. The destruction such a small beam of energy was beyond their wildest imagination. They could only look toward Lionel as though he was some sort of monster. It was at that moment that several cloaked figures descended from the skies, seemingly not worried about the planet's state in the slightest. All of their gazes locked onto Lionel. Chapter 9:12. Chapter 9:12. Forget LT. The destruction Lionel had just caused was enough to, ironically, put the fear of God in anyone. It was just an instinctual, ingrained fear that one would find it hard even to face this force, let alone fight against it. The truth was that as Lionel's body grew through the dimensions, so too did his Scarlet Star Force. To have a force known to cause the greatest destruction in his body made it a miracle that Lionel was even alive at this point. But that was the benefit he gained for having been born with such an innate force node. One might wonder then, did this mean that Lionel would never be capable of using his Scarlet Star Force? If it increased in difficulty to use every time he broke through, then what was the point of being born with such a force node to begin with? The reality though didn't quite work like this. It could be said that rather than Scarlet Star Force shackling Lionel, it was actually the other way around. For a force to be ranked amongst the top 10 of a powerful force like Star Force, one could imagine that this wouldn't just be for lower dimensions, but especially so for higher dimensions. In fact, the ranking system was based on the highest dimension said force could reach. Scarlet Star Force was essentially a high-dimensional force, forced to restrain itself in Lionel's body to an artificially lower dimension. This meant that every time Lionel broke through, Scarlet Star Force was actually just undoing chains Lionel placed on it. What was the difference between this and Scarlet Star Force growing with Lionel? The difference was that eventually, the Scarlet Star Force would return to its original state and stop outgrowing Lionel. When that day came, Lionel would finally be able to use the gift he was born with without reserve. For now though, even in the 5th dimension, Lionel felt like he was on the verge of dying after having used it for just a small moment. Still, the results shocked even Lionel himself. Lionel had been racking his brain trying to figure a way out of this. But he knew that even his current dream force wasn't enough to counter that seal. In the end, he had no choice but to bring out one of his greatest trump cards. What he hadn't expected, though, was to almost cause the destruction of the planet. Lionel had felt it. Had he been able to hold out for about 10 more seconds, he could have caused the entire planet to implode. Of course, asking for 10 more seconds when he had barely just held it for a split moment just now was far too much to ask. But the reality was shocking nonetheless. And it happened to be a reality that these cloaked figures had all witnessed. Even as lava overflowed from the split in the earth, they only had eyes for Lionel himself. Innate force node and a very powerful one at that. I have a feeling that you can't use that attack more than once, right? I wonder what kind of state your body is in right now. The man chuckled. Who asked you to blaspheme a 3-layer hand of the evergreen goddess? I would take a step back and let them hunt you down to the death, but they won't mind if I present your corpse to them with a small piece missing, right? The lead cloaked figure stared at Lionel as though he was looking at a priceless treasure. Lionel paused practically mid-cough. What did you just say? His tone was icy to an extreme. As ridiculous as it had been for the temperature to drop previously, it was even more ridiculous now. The heat of Scarlet Star Force still hung in the air. Even now, the foliage of the trees in the surroundings would spontaneously combust from time to time, erupting in a new rain of fire that would only make the situation worse. As though that wasn't enough, lava continuously pooled out from the split in the earth, forcing the youths in the surroundings to scatter and run, breaking the formation of the three organizations with absolute ease. And yet, the temperature still plummeted. Lionel's gaze locked onto the man before him, his fury from before still not having faded before this man dared to poke at the flames. When Lionel had learned that something of his had been taken out of his body when he was too young to do anything about it, he had already been furious. That anger wasn't satiated by his father helping him to regrow his innate force node. Rather, it was simply stored away. Lionel didn't care about the innate force node in all reality. After all, he hardly got to use it and had been living life just fine without knowing it existed. However, the principle of it all infuriated him to an extreme. He had a feeling that if he hadn't had such a powerful father, wouldn't he be dead right now? Wasn't this yet another example of the people of the dimensional verse doing as they pleased to the weak? Prattling on about survival of the fittest, etc., etc. Lionel had no idea whether his parents had already made those who did this to him pay or not, nor did he care. Even if they had, this anger wouldn't fade because it was rooted in something deeper than just himself. And yet, this cloaked bastard, come from nowhere, had actually thought to poke at that open wound. It was difficult to see the face of the cloaked figure, but Lionel could almost feel his smile spread out into a wide grin. His chest puffed out, his gaze flared with derision, his contempt was so palpable that it hung in the air like a foul odor. I said, forget it. Just die. Lionel said coldly. An enormous sniper rifle appeared in Lionel's hands. Before anyone could react, a beam of blinding golden light cut through the air. The cloaked man didn't even get a chance to finish his words before his head was eviscerated into nothing, his headless corpse teetering back and forth before failing to maintain its balance and plopping to the ground. Chapter 9:13. Chapter 9:13. No longer the cloaked figures that had been standing around the leading man stood in shock. Though he had a big mouth, that man was still a Tier 4 expert. One had to understand that not all Tier 4 experts were of the same strength. Just like Lionel could battle them with ease despite not having firmly stepped into Tier 1, there were many Tier 4 experts stronger than what the head of Misty Woods had displayed. The truth was that the head of Misty Woods had a large weakness. He needed to be in a state of prayer to display such strength. However, the cloaked man Lionel had just killed could display the same strength without needing to rely on a god or goddess. And yet, just like that, he had been killed. To make matters worse, they were standing almost half a kilometer from Lionel. They had thought to probe him to see if he really could use that attack again or not. And yet, the result was absolutely devastating. In the blink of an eye, one of theirs had been killed. Lionel didn't even react to this. Standing within 500 meters of a sniper even back on third-dimensional Earth was a death sentence. To the current Lionel, they would have to stand more than 10 kilometers away to have a chance at dodging. Lionel had wanted to use this battlefield as a chance to gain some battlefield experience and maybe hone himself a bit. The fact he wasn't taking this seriously was almost too obvious. He hadn't activated his bronze runes nor his spear domain. He was using a wooden spear and he had initially not even wanted to use the spear techniques he had learned previously. Unfortunately, his nonchalance almost caused him to suffer. Of course, there wasn't much he could do about being targeted by a god seal, but it still pissed him off. Then these cloaked figures, obviously being the hidden experts the Milky Way Guild had sent, pissed him off even more. Clearly, this wasn't going to be the battlefield he got to practice on. In that case, he might as well just end this all as quickly as he could have before. With a slight shift of his barrel, Lionel's sniper rifle whirred to life again. It was unlike anything those around had ever seen. The moment it jumped to life, the barrel began to radiate with a beautiful golden light, following the pattern of force arts etched directly onto it. Before the light could make it to the end, though, several hovering discs of precious metals appeared before the barrel of the rifle, each with a slight curve of their own. Bang! The instant the rifle fired, the light charged out, coursing through these hovering discs of gold. If one looked closely with every one it passed through, the beam of light only became more concentrated and faster. By the time it exited the last of the discs, it had a speed so fast that it was almost impossible to react to it all. In the blink of an eye, another had imploded. Run! The rest of the cloaked figures didn't dare to stay around any longer. Their hair stood on end and fear gripped their hearts. But what would running now do? With cold precision, Lionel sniped them down one after another. The last one that Fei. I had already managed to make it more than 7 kilometers away despite how fast Lionel was shooting, and yet it didn't matter at all. He fell just the same. Lionel swept a gaze over the scattered remains of the 3 organizations' army. Are you all going to run? Or would you like me to kill you too? The army, which had already been scattered, didn't need to hear this twice. Without hesitation they all dashed off, returning to the platform they had used to descend to the planet in the first place. They raged and jostled for position as they fought to be the first ones to leave. In the end, they ended up using far more time than they needed to eventually completely evacuate. Lionel's gaze on their backs was like the sigh of a reaper weighing down on them with a scythe. None of them even dared to look back as they rushed forward, unwilling to stay even a moment longer. Moments later, the battlefield was silent. Right then, there were several pairs of eyes on Lionel's back which seemed all too ridiculous considering the sight of lava still gushing forth before them all. And yet, Lionel seemed far more fascinating than it all. Hephaestus clutched his daggers. Raylion didn't seem to have much of an expression at all, but something within his eye told a different story. As for Sail, she felt a whirl of complicated emotions. Just 2 years ago she was powerful enough even to extend favors to Lionel. But now the difference between them was so great that she almost felt embarrassed. Was this the benefit of being born from such a large family? Even if Lionel didn't benefit from their resources, was just having a portion of their genes enough to warrant such an enormous gap between the two of them? Unfortunately, that seemed to be the way of the world. Lionel coughed lightly, another clump of black fog flying from his mouth. Luckily, the passive healing of his snowy star owl lineage factor had increased. Unluckily, so had his Scarlet Star Force's ability to cause trouble. Lionel didn't even bother to cast Grand Heal. He knew that at his current level, it was absolutely meaningless. It wouldn't even heal a paper cut for him right now. He needed to research stronger spells. Luckily, his run-in with Goddess Evergreen had given him some ideas. Finally, Lionel looked up into the skies, his gaze narrowing. Without looking back he spoke. I'm sure you all are smart enough to understand. From this day forth, Valiant Heart Mountain can no longer exist. For your own safety, I hope that none of you are stubborn about this. Chapter 9:14. Chapter 9:14. All her Fault Sail's heart sunk when she heard these words. At that moment it all clicked. She understood exactly why Lionel had apologized to her before the battle even began. From the very beginning he had already planned to say these exact words. This was his goal from the very beginning. You, Sail's voice trembled. She had tried so very hard, giving everything she had for the sake of keeping the organization she had been born in together. She owed Valiant Heart and her master everything she had. She had scratched and clawed, working herself to the bone so that she would never have to watch it crumble in her lifetime. The result of her hard work resulted in her neglecting her training. She had been so caught up in the politics that she forgot to raise her own strength. The result was her losing to Hephaestus and that reality slipping even further from her. After that, she had reapplied herself, nearly entirely forgetting politics just for the sake of gaining a larger fist. In fact, even now she had finally stepped into the quasi-fifth dimension. It was just unfortunate that this breakthrough often took decades, sometimes even more for those born in this region of the dimensional verse to complete. But once again, all of that was meaningless. Now she was being told the home she had done her all to protect was finished. And it would mostly be by the hands of the young man she brought here. Emotions of guilt, fury, unwillingness, all of it bubbled up within her. She didn't know whether she should cry, shriek, or rain down all the curses she could think of onto Lionel. She wanted him to both vanish from her sight and somehow repay Valiant Heart for all the harm he had caused at the same time. The result of all of this was her body trembling beside herself. She clenched her fists so tightly that even the blood that began to pool on her palm couldn't find a path out. It only seemed to make her skin more crimson, her emotions slowly spiraling out of control. All the while, Lionel didn't even look at her as though he couldn't be bothered to. Just as Sail was about to implode, she found a wrinkled hand suddenly find its place on her shoulder. When Sail looked over out of reflex, she was stunned to see that it was actually her master. It only took a moment for Lionel to recognize this old man as one of the 4 mysterious experts who had moved out with all of them that day. His aura seemed to be particularly weak, as though he had been injured some time before. However, it was still just as strong as anyone else within Tier 4 that Lionel had ever met. This made Lionel believe that he might have even actually been Tier 5 or maybe even Tier 6, maybe even stronger. Lionel's mind instantly flashed with a thought. Case 793, Teacher Ingson, guilty of gross negligence. In a campaign against our sworn enemy, the Oryx tribe, his decisions led to the death of 14 geniuses of our valiant Heart Mountain. The only survivor has been bribed into silence and has suffered through untold humiliation, Sale liars. Those were the exact words Ray Lion had said back then. Clearly, Ingson was more than just a teacher. In addition, the price he had paid to allow Sale to be the only survivor wasn't small in the slightest. The old man was practically on his deathbed. Beyond this, Lionel had a feeling that those 14 geniuses weren't just any geniuses either. They might have even been beyond Ray Lion in talent if they could go on a mission with Ingson. The question was, then why was Sale there? Of course, this was all just speculation. Lionel had no way of knowing these things. Thank you. Ingson spoke lightly. From this day forth, Valiant Heart Mountain will be no more. But that's enough, Sale. You're not a little girl anymore. If you want Valiant Heart to be revived one day, you just need to be strong enough that no one would dare to stop you. Sale opened her mouth to speak, but all that came out was a sob. She finally couldn't hold it in any longer and dove into her master's arms. It's my fault. It's all my fault, Ingson sighed, stroking Sale's hair. It's not your fault. This is the fault of us old men. We lost out edge and let our enemies eat away at us until there was nothing left. Ingson knew how Sale felt. She thought that everything she tried to do to help only ended in disaster. Ingson even had a feeling that if it wasn't for the fact she was so weighed down by the matters of the past, she would have long since entered the fifth dimension. Let alone Ray Lion and Hephaestus, Sale was probably the most talented disciple Valiant Heart Mountain had ever produced, including their founder who managed to gain the favor of a Morales family heir. Back then, Sale was too eager, wanting to skip steps and grow more powerful more quickly. She ended up sneaking her way onto a mission she had no business taking part in. The result was the death of 14 of her seniors and her own master being heavily injured to the point of near death. Of course, Ingson had told her many times that it wasn't her fault. Even if she hadn't been there, the casualties would have been terrible. It was a mistake on his part, not hers, that had caused such a thing. But the little girl had already internalized her guilt. And now she felt like she had done it again. It wasn't hard to point toward Lionel as the reason they would collapse now. He was, at the very least, a catalyst if not the cause. Without him, maybe they could have survived a few more centuries and found a chance to turn it all around. But with his appearance, they were finished. It was her fault again. It was her fault Valiant Heart lost 14 geniuses that would have been their chance to turn things around. It was her fault Valiant Heart's most powerful expert was so severely injured that they were no longer feared anymore. It was her fault that Lionel had been able to come here and quicken their destruction. It was all her fault. All her fault. Chapter 9:15. Chapter 9:15. Unexpected voice. Lionel sighed inwardly. It wasn't in his heart to do things like this, but he had no choice in the matter. The moment he had decided to take the side of the Oryx, the fate of Valiant Heart had already been sealed. He couldn't help but shake his head to himself. Was he very much different from those people he hated so much? Why was it that he chose the Oryx over Valiant Heart? Wasn't it because he felt that their talent was greater? In their state of hyper-evolution, they even had a chance at becoming monsters that could rival talents from dimensions far higher than this one. Due to this, Lionel had felt that if he was going to invest in a group, the Oryx would be the very best. He could tell himself now that he was just doing this out of necessity, that after he accomplished his goals he would treat everyone equally, but would things really work out that way? History told tales of absolute power corrupting absolutely. Lionel wouldn't deem himself to be the perfect human being, and no matter how logical he was, he would often find himself fighting against that side of his being. Often, Lionel felt that he only leaned into his own morality so much because he was scared that if he didn't follow archetype of good person to the final point, he would be giving himself up to that darkness within him. Lionel had always said that he didn't fear losing his life to save someone others would deem worthless. What he feared was the day he would convince himself that his life was worth more than others. If that day ever came, even he was scared of the monster he would become. Despite thinking and being aware of all of this, though, there was one reason Lionel didn't label himself a hypocrite, at least not completely. Valiant Heart had never wanted to help itself. During the time Lionel had spent with this organization, they were always fighting against progress, always gripped by a fear that not only stopped them from moving forward, but even forced them to regress. Despite knowing that he was a member of the Morales family, rather than taking this opportunity to soar into the skies once more, they cowered from it, worried about the consequences choosing to place their hopes in Lionel might cause. These simply weren't people that Lionel could take under his wing, at least not with how they were presently constructed. Unless they could change their mentality, this would be as far as any of them went. Lionel knew that he had a very fine line to toe. He both acknowledged that talent was necessary to make it in this world while simultaneously believing that it didn't make one person worth more than another. If he wanted to stick to such ideals, it would be difficult to keep his head straight. The good news was that he had been blessed with opportunity. He had Little Blackstar's ability steal powers on his side, and he had the silver tablet to wipe the consciousnesses away from them. This combination of treasures was almost perfect to deal with this moral dilemma, but it also made Lionel realize just how much luck was involved in this thing he called life. He had done all he could do for Valiant Heart. What was left was up to them. Young heir, Ingson called out once again to Lionel, trying to comfort Sale at the same time, please take the pillars with you. They were the treasures of the Morales family to begin with and were in no position to continue protecting them. Lionel, who was still facing away from the group and monitoring the air above, frowned. Those pillars? They had the ability to keep zones from permanently closing, thus allowing them to be repeatedly used as training grounds. It was a valuable set of equipment to have, especially if you managed to use them on a variant zone designed to bestow treasures to begin with. As good as this sounded, though, to the current Lionel, they were useless. Lionel's dreamscape suddenly flashed. Well, not completely useless, actually. With the new path of mage arts he was thinking up in his mind currently, the pillars would be a valuable asset and might even allow him to create an extremely powerful earth-space elemental art. However, Lionel couldn't help but feel disappointed. The fact that Ingson was trying to give these pillars to me signified that he truly had given up. Maybe it's wrong of me to judge him for this. He's been injured for several decades now and probably feels he's at the end of his rope with no chance to progress forward or even just heal himself back to his original height. Blaming him for this decision is cruel. Lionel took a deep breath, not responding immediately. After a while he nodded. I will hold them for you. If anyone of Valiant Heart decides that they are ready in the future, they can come to find me. A light of gratitude lit in Ingson's eyes. But he couldn't help but sigh when he looked down at the young girl in his arms. She had just been starting to cast the previous shadow on her heart away, finally allowing her to continue progressing. Would she ever manage to get rid of this one? Everyone, you've heard it well. This is no longer our home. You have half an hour to pack your belongings. The organization will send you all to a safe place as a final thank you for your service. Go. With heavy hearts, the students of Valiant Heart followed their orders. Those who had stayed behind so long despite the danger their lives were in were already the most loyal members of Valiant Heart to begin with. It was clear that none of them were willing. I guess they're not going to attack anymore? Lionel concluded. Just as Lionel was about to make a move to stop the flow of lava and dig up the pillars to his back, he heard an unexpected voice. Too cowardly to face what you've done, huh? Chapter 9:16. Chapter 9:16. Incisive Lionel didn't need to look back to recognize the voice of Hephaestus, of all people. Of course, Lionel knew why Hephaestus was saying these words. Lionel hadn't looked back from start to finish, so it wasn't too hard to guess that he was feeling guilty. However, it was still a bit of a surprise that Hephaestus would be the one to come to speak with him. From what Lionel could tell, everyone else had already rushed up the mountain. There wasn't even another line of defense here. It was clear that Ingson had trusted Lionel with protecting them while they went off to evacuate. But Hephaestus didn't seem to care much about this so-called evacuation. Cowardly? No. Guilty? I guess you can argue that. Lionel replied. The speed was too fast, and with a swoosh Wang Xian was pulled into the whirlpool, like a little crucian carp that had been hooked and was violently pulled out of the water. Hephaestus snorted. Semantics. That's a pretty big word for a muscle brain like you. Hephaestus' lip twitched. Wasn't this bastard supposed to be feeling guilty? Where did he find the face to quibble like this? If you dare to fish against him like this, no matter if it's a strange thing on a mobile phone or that ferocious giant fish, you'll have to pay the price. Plus, looking at Lionel now, even though it was hidden beneath his clothing, Hephaestus could tell that somehow this brat had come back with a physique even better than his own. So, who was the muscle brain exactly? Were you serious about keeping the pillars for us? Yes. Anyone who feels ready can come and get them from me. Even if I disagree that you are. It's not mine to begin with, I want police, which of you can take it. To be honest, it's not very useful to me now. Or rather, it will be in the short term but not in the long term. A fizzy is mocking him. So you're just going to wipe your hands clean of it all, HM? Don't you think you hold a bit of responsibility? Lionel shook his head and sighed, finally looking back toward Hephaestus. He was a bit surprised to find the abrasive young man to be red-eyed. He seemed caught between tears and rage despite how calm his voice had sounded previously. Hephaestus seemed as though he might eat Lionel alive. Who knows, maybe his ability would kick in and he would gain Lionel's ability as well. Who cared if he became a cannibal if he could accomplish what he and Ray Lion had always hoped to accomplish? Then, it was noisy and motionless. Instead of reviving here, it chose to disguise it. However, he didn't move. He knew that he was no match for Lionel 2 years ago, let alone now. He would just be setting himself up for death. Unlike Sale, he still hadn't given up. Ray Lion was too prideful to ask anything of Lionel. But he, as Ray Lion's right-hand man, would scratch and claw for anything he thought could help his brother rise to the very top. Lionel stared into Hephaestus' eyes for a long time. Despite the bestial aura radiating out from the latter, he seemed completely unmoved. If one's piece of sword energy can't solve the problem, then take a few more pieces. Wang Xian is going to kill it. Aren't you the one who's very cowardly now? Lionel spoke. Why are you beating around the bush? Just say what you want to say. What's there to be scared of? Hephaestus' jaw clenched. If a gaze could murder, Lionel would probably have died 10 times over. It's impossible for us to progress on our own. We'll always be labeled as the disciples of Valiant Heart. The other students might be fine, but those like Sale, myself and Ray Lion are too famous, we'll never be able to escape that label. No one would let us join their organization, and that would just be the bright side. The more likely scenario is that they'd offer us up to the 3 organizations or the Milky Way Guild to curry favor. Stop beating around the bush. Lionel repeated. Hephaestus' eyes were practically spewing fire at this point. Take responsibility. We will fight for you and even help in your air wars. We just want resources to help us grow. If we're left like this, we'll never be able to reach a point where we can take those pillars back. Hephaestus had expected Lionel to pause for a moment and think about it. After all, even if they couldn't compare to Lionel, they were still great talents, right? Even ignoring Sale and Ray Lion, he himself was mostly limited by the caliber of beast he got the chance to eat. Hephaestus was slotted into the Swallower Ability Index, which was also separated into 5 stages. Speed, Efficient, Blackbody, Steel, and Dimensional Gut. Speed allowed one to digest at impossibly fast speeds. Such a person could consume far more energy than another and thus recover far faster as well. Efficient allowed one to not only have the abilities of speed, but allowed them to eat with less wastage. Blackbody allowed one to consume 100% of the energy of their food and even directly convert it into power. It could be considered the pinnacle of efficient. Finally, there was Steel. The next step from converting food directly into power was snatching the powers their food had back when they were alive. As usual, the 5th, Dimensional Gut, was reserved for savants. Such existences were practically void beasts in human form. The things they swallowed no longer had to be living, and some could even digest entire worlds with a single bite. By this, Hephaestus' talent was clear. He was actually at the 4th Steel level. Even Ray Lion was only at the 3rd stage of his Telekinesis Ability Index. Of course, this was the case when Hephaestus was swallowing 4th dimensional beast. But who was to say he couldn't do the same with 5th dimensional ones as well? After all, he had never had the chance to try. This was all to say that Hephaestus thought Lionel would at least think about it. But Lionel didn't hesitate in his reply. Not only did he not hesitate, it was sharp, incisive, and left no room for rebuttal. After hearing it, Hephaestus was stuck in limbo, forgetting even the fact that he should have been enraged. He almost couldn't believe what it was that he was hearing to begin with. He was that close from asking Lionel to repeat himself. Absolutely not. I will not accept murderers into my people. As far as I'm concerned, you deserve to die. Chapter 917. Chapter 917. Deal? Lionel didn't understand these people. Did they just expect him to forget? What happened to those 3 disciples that he had hung from a tree? What happened to those disciples that had died testing his apparently faulty products? Was he just supposed to ignore the fact that ever happened? In fact, maybe the fact he wasn't cutting Hephaestus and Ray Lion down where they stood was him failing those victims. Hephaestus blinked and shook his head before he truly registered what had just happened. The rage in Lionel's voice was hidden under a layer of coldness, and just listening to it made him feel as though a bell was ringing in his ears. What Hephaestus didn't know was that this was Lionel's king's might seeping outward. If Lionel had been more intentional with his actions, Hephaestus' head might have already imploded just from his words alone. The speed was too fast, and with a swoosh Wang Xian was pulled into the whirlpool, like a little crucian carp that had been hooked and was violently pulled out of the water. At this point, the coercion in Lionel's voice was such that he could almost manifest his will into existence. Since Hephaestus was a dimension below him, he wouldn't even have the chance to fight back before his body listened to Lionel's will, almost as though these events were a story and Hephaestus was a character Lionel was writing. This was the difference between dimensions. A talent like Lionel might be able to rely on his lineage to fight above. But when a talent like Lionel was above a lesser talent like Hephaestus, the true difference between dimensions was as clear as day. The current Lionel might as well have been a god to Hephaestus. He could die to a single one of Lionel's thoughts. If you dare to fish against him like this, no matter if it's a strange thing on a mobile phone or that ferocious giant fish, you'll have to pay the price. It took a long while for Hephaestus to finally regain his bearings, but he felt as though his IQ had dropped by several points, like his brain had turned to mush. He completely forgot that he should have been enraged. When his vision cleared, he found Lionel still looking at him expressionlessly. But at that moment he felt a deep-rooted fear in his heart that seemed birthed from something intangible to become a heavy representation of his reality. Hephaestus shook his head. They're not dead. We just sent them away. They didn't have much talent as disciples anyway, so we just staged some stuff, gave them some money and shipped them off. To enjoy the rest of their lives. Ephizi is mocking him. The moment Hephaestus finished saying these words, he suddenly snapped. Fuck you. Hephaestus regained his fiery edge, his canines extending and his pupils becoming slits. He suddenly realized that he had fallen under Lionel's coercion. His rebuttal should have been a gotcha moment. But instead, it came out weak, as though he was pleading with Lionel to understand his plight. How could he not be seething? Then it was noisy and motionless. Instead of reviving here, it chose to disguise it. Ingson might have let them slander him, but he would have never allowed them to start killing disciples. For proof of this, one only needed to look at what happened to the seniors that tried to block Lionel, Aina and the other freshmen from entering the mines. Those seniors, for causing the potential deaths of their juniors, had been punished swiftly, harshly and without mercy. How could the seniors of Valiant Heart have reacted like that then, but suddenly let Raylion do as he pleased? If one's piece of sword energy can't solve the problem, then take a few more pieces. Wang Xian is going to kill it. Of course, Raylion was talented, so one might think he would get a bit of extra leeway. But even in his injured state, Ingson was still the most powerful individual in Valiant Heart Mountain. He could have done as he pleased, especially to a disciple that was blaspheming his name. Oh, so it's like that? Lionel's coldness vanished and he smiled lightly. Didn't you still try to kill me though? That's hard to forgive. Fuck you. You think I'm going to grovel at your feet? Die. Hephaestus attacked as swiftly and viciously as he could, his aura climbing to the point that the ground beneath his feet shattered, quite a decent feat for someone in the fourth dimension to accomplish on a fifth-dimensional world. However, Lionel only chuckled and caught his wrist. All right. There's no need to throw a temper tantrum, right? I was just joking around. Lionel had used a bit of his coercion to force down Hephaestus' barriers and get him to tell the truth. But, surprisingly, the truth was different from what he thought it would be. It could be considered to be a pleasant surprise, actually. Hephaestus kept attacking furiously, even trying with his legs and feet, but it was all to no avail. Lionel knocked him out and threw him over his shoulder, casually strolling to the pillars with a grown man hanging from his side. He placed a palm on the pillars, feeling the ancient carvings dance across his fingers. Yes, this could definitely work. Definitely. Gross. Stop drooling, will you? In the spaceship above Planet Valiant, it was safe to say that Greta was seething. But at the same time she didn't dare to go down. Contrary to what one might expect, this wasn't because she was afraid of Lionel, but rather that she didn't dare to show her face. If she did, things would only become even worse for the Milky Way Guild, which was already experiencing some trouble. At that moment, a welling up of dread filled her heart. She had already taken a risk by okaying this operation. Now, not only had the three organizations suffered great losses, but among them, 3 fifth-dimensional existences fell. As though that wasn't bad enough, she had lost 5 fifth-dimensional subordinates that she had worked hard to groom over the last several decades. There was no way that she could make up for such a loss to herself in a short time. None of this even mentioned the kind of punishment she would receive this time. Greta even began to think of running away. Maybe this time if she dared to go back to the guild she would really be finished. Was there any coming back from this? However, where would she go? To another galaxy? Traveling between galaxies required at least a sixth-dimensional ship, though. How would she procure such a thing? She definitely couldn't stay in the Milky Way. If she did, there wasn't a single corner she could hide in where she wouldn't be found. Fear began to flood Greta's heart, more and more crazed thoughts forcing her scar to tremble and wiggle about as though it had a mind of its own. She had to kill Lionel. That was the only way to survive. It was the only way to survive. It was exactly at that moment that Greta received a call. But when she heard the voice on the other side, she couldn't help but be frozen solid. "Hello, little sister, your big sis is here to save you. How about we make a deal?" Chapter 9:18. Chapter 9:18. Blasted open sail stood in a training room, her expression quite blank. Dried streaks of tears left trails of salt down her cheeks, but she didn't seem to notice. She had lost count of how much time she had spent in this training room. It was quite funny, she had made so little progress despite how much time she had put it. At the same time, as much as she would miss Valiant Heart Mountain, she probably had the most memories in this place as opposed to any other, this bland, gray-walled, vacuous space. As for packing her things up, Sail realized that there really wasn't much to take. When it came to the resources, she decided to let those lesser than herself have those things. When it came to her personal things, all of the most important items were in her storage ring anyway. She just wanted to stand here. The speed was too fast, and with a swoosh Wang Xian was pulled into the whirlpool, like a little crucian carp that had been hooked and was violently pulled out of the water. Sail forgot about the half-an-hour time limit and just stood without a word for a length even she wasn't aware of. It wasn't until there was a sudden click at the door that she snapped away, turning her head over. But when she saw who it was, she simply looked away, her gaze remaining blank. "What do you want?" she asked. In her mind, she thought her voice would come off colder. But the reality was just that it sounded quite broken and hollow. She didn't have enough energy to put up a tough front. She just turned away, not facing the person. If you dare to fish against him like this, no matter if it's a strange thing on a mobile phone or that ferocious giant fish, you'll have to pay the price. This person was surprisingly Ray Lion. "Are you done?" he asked. The words in context sounded like he was asking about Sail's state of packing. But both of them knew quite well that Ray Lion was actually referring to something far deeper than just this. A fizzy is mocking him. "Isn't that exactly what you wanted?" Sail replied. "For me to give up and hand everything to you? Well, now you've gotten your wish. Congratulations. Enjoy these empty walls none of us can protect." Ray Lion didn't answer for a long while as the two stood in silence. "You aren't the woman I've been chasing after." Then it was noisy and motionless. Instead of reviving here, it chose to disguise it. The words were like a stone thrown into a still lake. They seemed to be layered with two meanings that made Sail tremble. "All those years ago, Teacher Ingson chose you as his 15th disciple. I didn't say anything and just accepted it, even after he said that he would never take another. I've always been jealous of you. You are more talented than I am. You have more support than I do. And even though we are both without family, you at least have a little brother left while I have nothing. If one's piece of sword energy can't solve the problem, then take a few more pieces. Wang Xian is going to kill it. As much as you love Valiant Heart Mountain, I love it 10 times more. As much as this might pain you, it pains me 100 times more. As much as you want to give up, I want to give up 1,000 times more. But I haven't." Ray Lion turned to walk away. "I really look down on you, Sail." Sail's shoulders shuddered, her eyes reddening as her dried tears threatened to burst forth once again. Lionel stood at the mountain pass, continuously drawing in the air with a finger. Every swipe he made seemed to carry a unique air to it. If it wasn't for the fact he was carrying a grown man over his shoulder, he might have even looked to be quite enigmatic. An odd force began to follow the flow of Lionel's finger. It was an extremely pale violet that was difficult to spot with the high sun above their heads like this, and it didn't seem intent on growing any brighter. Even Lionel himself could only gain a faint glimpse of it. To others it might not seem to be there at all. Lionel had spent a long time thinking about how to strengthen his mage arts. But he realized that his thinking had been far too rigid in this regard. Whenever he prepared to create a mage art, his first thought would be about the practicality of the element and what it could accomplish. For example, the light element was good for healing, the star element was quite hefty and good for energy, etc., etc. But after seeing the lotus of arms and hands, Lionel realized that his thinking was lacking. He thought to himself, If he had the wood element as an affinity, how would he use it? Would he be able to create such a powerful result? The answer to that was no. He probably wouldn't even consider using the wood element to attack. He would use it for area control and at most use it for life stealing. However, he would never even consider the possibility that it could create such flexible, powerful attacks. It was then that he realized what he was missing. Grand Bell Construct had been one of the most powerful defensive spells Lionel had. But why was its shape important? Why was it a bell and not a shield or a dome? Why was it that if Lionel tried to change its form, it would weaken? Lionel's conclusion was that there was an underlying natural force to the substance of an object. Wasn't this where universal force originated from? It was the comprehension of one of the most natural and ubiquitous cycles of the dimensional verse. Reflecting the four season or heavenly bodies in one's comprehension gave a tangible boost to one's strength. But who was to say that these cycles were the only things that held such a power? What if Grand Bell Construct was so powerful because it embodied the essence of an ancient bell? What if his Snowy Star Owl's instant recovery was so powerful because it embodied the essence of a mythical creature? What if he started forming spells not from scratch, but rather using natural phenomena and powerful treasures of the dimensional verse instead? The possibilities were endless when he thought of things this way. He could imagine fire arts created from powerful mythical creatures. He could imagine star arts formed by observing real stars. He could imagine using medicinal herbs to form recovery arts. He could even imagine space arts created from observing void beast. Just what kind of result would that have? And right now, observing the force arts that formed this pillar, Lionel felt like he was on the verge of creating a spell so powerful it even made him shudder. A world of fifth-dimensional mage arts had been blasted wide open. Chapter 919. Chapter 919. Something within Lionel clicked. If one looked within his dream world, it would be possible to find a partially complete dream sculpt of the Valiant Pillars. The truth was that the Valiant Pillars weren't a simple treasure. They had aspects far above the fifth dimension to their design, and obviously Lionel didn't have the time to dream sculpt all of it, nor would there be a point to. After all, in his current state, the best mage arts he could use would be in the fifth dimension. Luckily, Lionel's skill in dream sculpt had increased. He was able to lower the resolution of portions that would slow his progress and sculpt the parts he needed in the highest resolution possible. This technique not only allowed him to dream sculpt things with greater speed, but it also left him with just enough information to go back and complete the dream sculpt later should he need it, using the parts of lower resolution to deduce a higher resolution result. The speed was too fast, and with a swoosh Wang Xian was pulled into the whirlpool, like a little crucian carp that had been hooked and was violently pulled out of the water. This dream sculpt had been completed by Lionel long ago. In the past several minutes, he had been using it as the foundation for a new mage art, his finger continuously sweeping through the air. Fascinating. King's Might makes it easier for me to see through the essence of something and capture what makes it. Then these mage arts would probably benefit from having King's Might incorporated into them. Lionel took a deep breath. Valiant Seal. If you dare to fish against him like this, no matter if it's a strange thing on a mobile phone or that ferocious giant fish, you'll have to pay the price. In that moment, all the wind of the world seemed to freeze as though time itself had come to a halt. The air itself solidified, compressing onto itself in layers and making it harder and harder to move. Just then the ground began to tremble. Something began to rise from beneath the surface, forming a dome of earth at first and quickly refining itself into a polished cylindrical construct. The moment this odd pillar began to manifest, the impact on the world it had accelerated. By this point, the green leaves of trees stopped swaying, the grass no longer rustled, and even the lava that had been flowing in the area came to a grinding halt, not moving forward a single inch more. A fizzy is mocking him. The pillar had only risen half a foot out of the ground when Lionel cut his force off, forcing the spine-tingling phenomena to come to a stop. Lionel coughed, his charred organs acting up again. Toward this, he could only shake his head. If he was still in the fourth dimension of his metal body, he could probably try absorbing some star core, refractive gold or blazing night to heal himself. But he had already broken into the fifth. He wasn't sure if those fourth-dimensional ores would still have the impact he wanted. Then, it was noisy and motionless. Instead of reviving here, it chose to disguise it. The good news, though, was that those combination of ores had indeed helped his body to withstand his Scarlet Star force a bit better. If not for this, his metal body, which currently couldn't even truly be considered Tier 1, wouldn't stand a chance. I need to find fifth-dimensional ores very soon. I also need to heal myself. It seems that the Force Crafting Guild really is the place I have to go. But maybe, Lionel narrowed his eyes. His experience with creating Valiant Seal taught him a few things. If one's piece of sword energy can't solve the problem, then take a few more pieces. Wang Xian is going to kill it. First, with a reference to work with, creating new mage arts was far easier and tens of times faster. This was probably the inverse for someone else, but for Lionel, who had his dream sculpt ability, it wasn't a problem in the slightest. In fact, it could be said that Lionel practically had a cheat code toward creating mage arts now. The second thing he learned, which was a proxy to the first, was that these mage arts he created would be far more powerful, not to mention having far less drain on his stamina. This latter conclusion was a surprise to Lionel, but he came to understand after a moment. When Lionel deduced the creation of new mage arts, he was building something from the ground up. In addition, though he could streamline the process later, this would often weaken the effective result of the mage art. Lionel's attempts at building mage arts from the ground up resulted in overly elaborate, though quite beautiful and intricate, constructs. Unfortunately, that made it so that they took time and effort to draw in battle. To Lionel, it was still possible due to his abilities. But, just because he could do it didn't mean that he should, even if he could often quickly replenish the dream force he used thanks to his stars. However, now, with King's Might involved, Lionel only had to use half the dream force he would have to otherwise. Coupling that with a far less complex mage art overall, and this resulted in an added ease that could be measured in tens of times. Of course, this was only in comparison to if Lionel had to build up a mage art from scratch that accomplished the same goal. Just now, Lionel had felt that if he completed the cast of Valiant Seal, it would have taken up 10% of his stamina, and that was just with the formation of one pillar. He had already calculated that for the best, foolproof method of use, he would need to form 4 pillars. That meant a single cast of Valiant Seal would take almost half of his stamina up. And that was the simplest form of Valiant Seal, with much of its more complex portion drawn out in low resolution. On the other hand, if he used his original method, he would have needed to wait until he reached the peak of the 5th dimension to even dream of casting it at all. If that was the case, what Lionel needed to think of wasn't new mage arts to use, but he rather needed valuable references that were worth him creating mage arts based off on. With a thought, Lionel took out a special herb he had had with him for years. Back during the Hive Island event, he managed to plunder this herb, 3-vein mending weed. Lionel remembered his curiosity back then quite well. He wondered if he could incorporate the natural force arts of this quasi-black grade herb into his armor to give it self-healing properties. Of course, back then, he hadn't known enough about his divine armor to know that it was naturally ingrained with such an ability to begin with. Now that he thought about it, he had definitely been really close to using nature as his muse back then. This was just a quasi-black grade herb, but it was a good test to see just how powerful this new method of force art creation was. Chapter 920. Chapter 920. Need Lionel didn't have to dream sculpt this herb. He had already done so back then, and it took him an entire 2 days. Of course, it would only take him a split second now, but that hardly mattered. Lionel closed his eyes for a moment before they flashed open. Mending light. Lionel's body suddenly began to glow as crisscross patterns of what looked like blade marks erupted across him. One could have thought that some sort of light elemental swordsman had instantly cut him into 1,000 pieces before retracting his blade. Soon, the patterns solidified and sunk into Lionel's body like some sort of binding rope. Even Lionel couldn't help but be fascinated by the method the mage art took. Usually, when he built mage arts from the ground up, he would know exactly how it would function before he cast it. But this form of mage arts gave him little surprises from time to time. I wonder, no 2 herbs are identical. What would happen if I had used a different herb of this exact same species? Would the pattern be different? Lionel was completely intrigued. It took him a moment to actually begin analyzing the results. The impact was minimal. But the fact there was a slight change at all is shocking enough. That was a 3rd-dimensional mage art, yet it still had some impact, though some of that is because it was created with 5th-dimensional light force. There's a glaring problem though. The 3-vein mending weed is a wood elemental herb. Using it as the basis of a light elemental art is already handicapping it. I not only need to find a stronger herb as a foundation, it also needs to be one that fits with the affinities I have. This was the 3rd thing Lionel realized. He couldn't just use any reference. Why was his Valiant Seal so powerful? It was because he had the appropriate earth and space elemental affinities. In fact, because his space affinity was reliant on his divine armor, if he ever chose to build a divine armor with a different element, he likely would never be able to reach the full potential of Valiant Seal. That was something he needed to be aware of. This path. It's excellent. Lionel found himself to be quite excited about this. But at the same time, the dread of missing out creeped back up again. If he hadn't run into the head of Misty Woods and he hadn't been forced to use his religion in a bid against him, how long would it have taken Lionel to have this breakthrough? There was just so much of this world that he had no idea about. Holding myself up and thinking of ways to accelerate my strength will never work. I need to experience the world. A groggy voice suddenly caught Lionel's attention. Hey. What the hell is this? Let me down. Let me down right. Lionel let Hephaestus go, causing the latter to fall right onto his large nose. It was safe to say that Hephaestus was furious. First he had been humiliated by Lionel. Then he had been easily defeated. Then, as though that wasn't bad enough, he was held up like a sack of potatoes, then dropped to the ground like trash. He jumped to his feet. Though his nose wasn't broken, as it would take far more than just that to harm his body, it still began to bleed, making his fury funnier than it should be. Just when Hephaestus was going to implode, he and Lionel both noticed a figure descending from the skies. Flying was a difficult thing to do unless you had an ability or a treasure that helped you. Clearly, this person was among the former group and had an ability. It didn't take long for Lionel to realize that it was Ray Lion. Ray Lion touched down to the ground, standing exactly 2 meters from Lionel and the furious Hephaestus. He was just as apathetic as ever. This was the same expression he had worn even after Aina had beaten him all those months ago. He just seemed unmoved by most things. Let's go, Hephaestus. But Hephaestus had gone through all that trouble to lower himself and ask Lionel to let them join all so that Ray Lion didn't have to do the same. But clearly Ray Lion still had no intention of staying like this. Ray Lion didn't say anything to convince Hephaestus. He simply turned and walked away. Hephaestus let out a deep sigh. He knew that there wasn't anyone more prideful than Ray Lion. Or maybe there was. But he had just yet to meet the person. Even against such odds, he had no intention of bending a knee. Hephaestus swept a glance at Lionel, half pleading. But it soon became obvious to him that Lionel had no intention of saying anything either. He felt a flash of hatred for Lionel, but it was quickly overwhelmed by helplessness. Why would the potential heir of such a powerful family care about them enough to lower his pride for their sake? He probably thought Ray Lion's so-called pride to be nothing more than a joke. Hephaestus clenched his fists and his canines nearly shattered as his jaw trembled. They hadn't known previously that Lionel had such a strong background. Inkson and Hutchin had only recently let it slip. Their meaning had been clear. They hoped that some of them would be taken under Lionel's wing. But Sale was broken, Ray Lion was too prideful, and he wanted to stay by Ray Lion's side. That was his brother, he couldn't leave him for greener grass now. Hephaestus turned and walked away, his poor posture straightening in a rare instance. I need information. The voice came suddenly and out of nowhere. It was clearly from Lionel, but when Hephaestus' head snapped back, Lionel was already no longer there. And I need a lot of it. The voice rang again. Ray Lion didn't seem to have stopped his steps for even a moment. But if one could gaze into his eyes, it would be possible to witness a blazing fire. Chapter 921. Chapter 921 Bureaucracy. The Force Crafting Guild was a place of abject luxury. Every tree, every blade of grass, every paved road, and every crystal-clear window was immaculately sculpted. Not a single thing was out of place, and the pompousness could almost be smelled through the air. Although Lionel had never been to the capital of Earth while war wasn't raging, he had always imagined that it was like this. However, even to his imagination, this place felt like a bit too much of an exaggeration. Every person he passed by seemed to want to make sure that their status was plastered for all to see. They wore their badges prominent to one chest and their affiliations just as proudly to the other. Their noses were practically so high in the air that they didn't even bother to look down on Lionel for dressing so casually. How could they? Their gazes were enraptured by the skies above. It was a miracle that they weren't constantly bumping into one another on the road. Clearly they weren't looking where they were going to begin with. It could be said that the only good thing about this place was that the air was exceptionally pure and clean. There was even a slight fragrance to it that reminded Lionel of a bakery, but it also wasn't overwhelming to the point it was taking up all of his senses. In fact, it was barely noticeable at all. That, though, was where all the good stopped. The moment he had stepped foot into this place, he had been under scrutiny. First, at the gates he was scanned from top to bottom. The check was even more invasive since he didn't have a crafter's badge or an affiliation to name. They checked everything from his age to his dimension level, and at some point he was certain the formation they had active took a scan of his teeth as though they might need to identify him when he died. After dealing with that ridiculousness, he needed to deal with filling out a questionnaire that would put any security detail at an airport to shame. Not only did he need to state his purpose, how long he would be here, etc., there was even questions asking him about how often he might need to use the bathroom. When he asked the attendant why they were asking such ridiculous questions, he received an answer from a completely straight-faced lady that said, "We don't want needless waste from outsiders." It was like they thought Lionel taking a dump would shift their ecosystem for the worst. But now that they were being so insistent, Lionel almost wanted to lay a deuce for the ages. He had never seen a place more pompous in his life. It made him feel the urge to piss from some tall walls. He had wondered why even his father's training program hardly mentioned the force crafting guilds, and now he had a pretty good idea why. Lionel still remembered clearly the killing intent in his father's eyes when he mentioned treating little Tali like a friend and companion, not a tool. That fury had to stem from somewhere, and if Lionel had to guess, it was most definitely from this place. Halt. This region is for crafters alone. Common citizens are not allowed to step foot into this region. Tall guards wearing the most ridiculous golden armor stunted with diamond Lionel had ever seen stopped his forward progress. Shaking his head, Lionel presented his documents. He had already gone through all that trouble of filling out those papers, something that had taken up almost 12 hours of his time, so he wouldn't run into trouble later. At least now it was all prepared and ready. He just wanted to get this over with as soon as possible. After all, he was still in constant pain. Having your inner organs charred to near ash was not a good feeling. If he wasn't dulling the pain with dream sense, he might not even be standing right now. "I've come to take my Force Crafter exam," Lionel spoke. The guards, each of whom was difficult to look at straight due to how blinding their armor was, looked Lionel up and down. As though seeing him for the first time, they scrutinized his clothing and demeanor. It became clear quite quickly that they weren't impressed with what they saw. One of the guards was about to speak when another pressed a hand to his chest, stopping him. The two made eye contact and a look of realization dawned upon the latter as though he suddenly remembered something. "The Force Crafter exam won't be taking place today. Come again another time." What? Lionel was stunned. He wasn't paying very much attention to the actions of the guards because he thought it was all just a formality. But when he heard these words he was stunned. Lionel had just gone through customs to enter this city. According to all the stuff he had filled out, that was his purpose in this place. With how strict the rules were, if he couldn't become an official Force Crafter he wouldn't be allowed to stay. But if he wasn't allowed to stay, that would mean he would have to come back and repeat this process all over again tomorrow. Not only would that mean another day of this pain in his organs, it would also mean that he would have to use another 12 hours to go through all that bureaucracy once again. As though that wasn't bad enough, who's to say they would even allow him through this time? He had read through the entire sheet and there was a question about how often he had visited the Force Crafting Guild city in the past. Lionel had no doubt that the fact his answer was 0 weighed in favor of him entering. What if there was a hidden cap on the number of times individuals could enter this place? Wouldn't he be screwed then? Lionel's gaze turned cold when he thought through all of this. What? Chapter 922. Chapter 922 charges. The guards were stunned by Lionel's question. Were they being doubted? The two suddenly began to look around as though to check whether or not they were in a dream world. Seeing the individuals walking around, some of which had actually noticed that something was off only to begin observing, they quickly came to the realization that they were, indeed, not in a dream. Some Tier 1 fool was actually questioning them? Lionel stood in silence, his gaze carrying with it a hint of cold. However, without even answering, the sound of tearing paper resonated through the gate entrance. Lionel could only watch as the documents it had taken him half a day to earn were torn to pieces. His gaze followed the fluttering pieces of paper as they were whisked away by the wind. The guard who acted seemed intent on staring him down as he tore the documents into smaller and smaller pieces, trying to humiliate Lionel to the greatest extent. It was as though they were eager for Lionel to snap, waiting for him to attack so that they'd have all the reason in the world to teach him a more physical lesson. "The Force Crafter's exam will not be taking place today. Come again another time." The words were repeated by the sneering guard. "If you can, that is." The spectators watched on in curiosity, some who were even waiting to enter the guild after Lionel, rolling their lips over one another as though to hold themselves back from laughing. One of the first rules anyone who came to this planet would learn was the importance of status. The second rule they would learn was the importance of not offending those your status couldn't be above. As long as you followed these two rules, even if you were trampled all over, you would at least be left with a small bit of a face. The question was if you were willing or able to protect this small bit and go about your merry way. Over the years, there weren't a small number of individuals who hadn't managed to control their anger. However, each one of them had a more miserable ending than the last. By now, it had already been a very long time since anyone tried to stir up trouble. Or, at the very least, it had been a very long time since anyone who dared to cause trouble actually managed to stir up any waves. Usually, such people would end up like Lionel here, having barely gotten a question out before suddenly and harshly being ruthlessly suppressed without even room to breathe. Lionel didn't say a word as they guards continued to sneer. "What are your names?" The second question came out of nowhere almost like the first. In fact, it stunned the two guards once more before the one who tore up the documents began to laugh uproariously. "Who the hell are you to ask for our names? Didn't you hear me earlier?" Scram. The second guard laughed maybe even harder than the first. No, hold on. The little guy must be thinking of revenge. How about we give him some hope, Rio? My name is Xander. Now that you know, what are you going to do about it? I'll give you 3 seconds before we throw you out of here. Xander already had at least 3 charges he could drop on Lionel's head. With how harsh the punishment was in the guild's territory, this alone would be able to get him locked away for years, not to mention being pinned with an additional ban even after he got out. He couldn't help but chuckle as he thought of how this bastard was just ruining himself because he didn't know how to control his rage. What Xander and Rio didn't know, though, was that if Lionel really wasn't able to control his anger, they would already be dead. Lionel didn't even look them in the eye as they reported their names. He stretched out a finger, causing dozens of thin strings of neutral force to connect with the fluttering torn pieces of document. The moment these 4 strings connected, the papers vanished into Lionel's spatial ring. Xander and Rio put on odd expressions when they saw this. What was the point of that exactly? They were more baffled by the action and didn't even register just how much skill it would have taken to replicate what Lionel had just done. Do you know how many monitoring force arts there are in this region? Xander? Rio? Lionel asked the third question. The 2 guards frowned, but this time, Lionel didn't let them answer as he began to point. There's one at every street corner. Given their scopes, there were 4 that had a vantage point toward this location. There are 2 at the top of this very gate that makes 6. And finally there's my own, making 7 in total. Lionel finally looked up again. But even when his gaze met theirs, it felt as though he was seeing right through them, as though they weren't truly worthy of him gazing upon them. Do you know why I bothered to tell you all of this? The reason is quite simple. Lionel's fingers flipped over, suddenly revealing a piece of torn paper pinched between 2 of them. On this torn piece of paper, there was a symbol that looked like it had just been freshly stamped. Clearly, it was an authentication seal, something that represented the guild's bureaucracy department. What do you think the punishment for destroying government documents is, exactly? The 2 guards froze. Back in a certain office, a young woman with a cold expression sat at her desk, reviewing some things. She had her hair up in a neat bun without even a single strand out of place and skin-tight office clothing that clung tightly to her curvaceous body. However, with her expression, it was hard for anyone to sexualize her. Suddenly she froze. Jem? He was approved? Oh, that should be impossible. Before the young woman could even investigate, a man with an expression just as cold walked into her office. Chapter 923. Chapter 923. Bad Luck. Amori, what is the meaning of this? The stoic middle-aged man stood before the cold young woman, his expression even colder than it usually was. Amori, who had just been delving deep into her own thoughts, was thrown completely off guard by this line of questioning. She hurriedly stood to display her respect, but this didn't help her understand what her superior was getting at. Zring narrow. Amori's back stood tall and straight as though she was a soldier rather than the office worker she truly was. She was maybe a bit too eager in her actions because her button-down shirt almost threatened to burst. Luckily, the material was flexible and durable enough to hold up. Ignarol, though, didn't seem to notice this in the slightest. Instead, he pulled out a tablet that looked as though it was pulled right from Earth's technological age. And yet, when one looked at its screen, there were nothing but floating force art nodes. It was impossible for a layman to understand just what it was that they were seeing. But Agnero read through it as though it was written in plain and simple English. According to this, there was an indefinite visa approved for entry into the guild's territory today. Didn't I tell you that all such processes should be stopped? This is a sensitive time. Only those who had already been accepted into an affiliation should be allowed here at this time. You don't usually make such mistakes. What is happening? Amori blinked in shock. So, it really was about that. Sir, I did everything according to your orders. But it would cause problems if everyone who came was simply turned away, so Subordinate adjusted the entry requirements to make it so that it should be impossible to enter. Subordinate has no idea how one slipped through. I triple and quadruple checked the algorithm. Agnero frowned. Though Amori didn't follow what he asked her to do exactly, this was part of the reason she had risen through the ranks so quickly. She understood how to not only follow orders, but how to also choose the best method to do so as well. In this case, she was once again thinking of the larger picture. The Force Crafting Guild was already labeled as quite uppity and noble by outside sources. It was just that they provided such a necessary service and they were so powerful that the quibbles of the commoners hardly mattered. However, even for their guild, simply turning everyone away without cause or reason would breed more resentment than they were willing to handle. After all, they were just a small branch of the main guild. Even if they enraged all the powers in this region and ended up getting destroyed, there was little the main guild would be able to do. Of course, getting revenge for the main guild would be as easy as snapping a finger. But by then they would already be dead. So how would that help them? To make matters worse, it was unlikely that the powers in this region would do such a thing. It was more likely that they would try to suppress the guild in various ways, and that would be even more annoying to deal with. In truth, the odds of these things happening was very small. But there were always a few madmen who couldn't understand logic and reason, only to go about doing as they pleased anyway. Though these madmen would often suffer terrible fates, it wasn't like their victims could come back to life. This was all to say that maintaining a balance and at least a facade of fairness wasn't a bad idea for the longevity of the guild in this region. So, rather than just turning everyone away due to the special guest they were receiving, Amori decided to modify the algorithm that decided whether a visa would be granted or not to make it so that it would be impossible for anyone to be granted access. And yet, somehow, Lionel was still approved. Show me his documents. Agnero said coldly. Yes, sir. Amori reacted quickly, finding Lionel Morales and passing everything on to her superior. She had just been about to look through them after realizing what happened. But she suppressed her curiosity. Agnero flipped through Lionel's answers, realizing that each one only got more and more sarcastic as he went on. He could almost feel Lionel's contempt for them all, and yet he didn't miss even a single line. Agnero had turned his fair share of people away for accidentally missing questions, and most of them had been annoyed with the long process like Lionel. Yet, Lionel himself hadn't made this mistake. There's nothing special about these answers. Could it be a mistake with Amori's change to the algorithm? But that was unlikely with her thoroughness. In addition, there were 10,877 people who tried to gain entry today, yet only one of them got through? If it was a problem with the algorithm, there would have been more than this. Unless, Agnero suddenly threw of a possibility. Give me his biometrics. Amori was stunned. Biometrics were saved and stored, but once again to protect against public outrage, there was a large burden that needed to be proven to allow them to be accessed. After all, no one wanted themselves to be laid bare like this just to visit a place. But this was the way of the world. Rules were only for the weak. Agnero got his hands on everything from Lionel's teeth x-rays to his blood samples. What he saw made him widen his eyes. By the end of it, his pupils simply couldn't constrict any further. What bad luck. A talent like this shouldn't be in this galaxy. Where did he come from? And why on this day of them all? What he saw could all be summed up in 2 lines. Age, 21 dimension, Tier 1, 5th. Before Agnero could even think of making a decision, his tablet vibrated and a voice began to speak. Agnero, Lady Anya is prepared to take her Force Crafter's exam. Chapter 924. Chapter 924. Blood Mercury. Lionel stood before the gates indifferently. Did he think that this would be enough to make it in? Quite frankly, he doubted it. However, he had to try no matter what. The truth of the matter was that the greatest issue he was facing weren't his injuries or even the time it would take to go through this process all over again. Of course, these things were major problems, but they weren't existential. The main issue was that this might be one of the only chances he ever got to enter the guild normally. Lionel hadn't forgotten that he was still a wanted criminal. The universe was just so large that enforcing such things was difficult, especially when the information had been suppressed by those who put out his warrant to begin with. However, Lionel wasn't a fool. There was still very much a chance that he would be exposed soon. When that time came, this matter would only blow up all the more. By then he wouldn't have a chance to exchange 12 hours for entry into this place at all, even if he was willing. He had to take this opportunity while his name and face weren't known galaxy-wide to accomplish some things, or else he would just ram headfirst into trouble wherever he went. If Lionel had to point out what his goals were right now, it was to place down a solid foothold in the Milky Way that extended beyond what he could build on Earth. He didn't know why, at least it wasn't something he could put into words, but for some reason he innately saw his own grandfather as competition. He saw Earth as a place to be conquered, not as a power backing him. Looking at things this way, Lionel was on his own. But he wasn't aimless. Since the Milky Way Guild was targeting him, he didn't mind sacrificing it toward his goals. What better way to lay a foundation than to use the resources of the largest merchant guild in the galaxy? This was all to say that Lionel couldn't be stalled here, not now. For all he knew, Shield Cross Stars was already aware of his appearance here. He didn't know how deep their hooks had sunk into this galaxy, but he had to be cautious. Just as Lionel was fully prepared for the worst-case scenario, a commotion to his back never allowed the guards to reply to his hardly veiled threat. Turning back, Lionel found a carriage of white wood and golden leaves being pulled along by a white steed. The beast's limbs were powerful and its mane was long and pristinely tailored. In truth, it felt as though the beast had stepped right out of fairy tale. The only thing it was missing was a horn, and Lionel would believe he had been teleported into another mythological zone, this one being for Cinderella. However, though this horse looked like a relatively normal horse Lionel would even be able to find on Earth, this was only on the surface. Lionel could sense that its blood was very heavy, rushing through its veins like mercury. Its eyes didn't seem to be formed of flesh, but rather of an intangible light that floated within their sockets. And, most shocking of all, this steed was within the quasi-sixth dimension, and yet it was only tasked with pulling a carriage. That carriage is a silver treasure. The longer Lionel observed, the more ridiculous it all seemed to become. Carriages weren't exactly frequently seen, especially not on this planet. As one might have expected, those who were allowed vehicles were those of high standing, and most of them chose to travel through the air in sleek top-of-the-line shuttles. Everyone else had to use their own 2 feet. Only when it was necessary to cross large distances would they use convenient teleportation hubs drawn from force arts. This was to say that this carriage was the only one on the streets, and its destination was also quite clear. The expressions of Xander and Rio changed. "Get out the way, move, move." Rio barked at both Lionel and the others lining up behind him. Currently, there was a queue waiting to enter the main territory of the guild. Of these queues there were 2. One door for those who could enter and exit the main guild freely, and a second for those like Lionel who had more special circumstances. These 2 doors were only small side entrances to the main gate. However, in order to open the main gate, both doors had to be closed and the mechanisms had to be activated. Obviously, whoever could ride in a silver-grade treasure pulled along by a quasi-sixth-dimensional beast couldn't possibly use a side entrance to enter the guild. Xander and Rio hadn't expected the special guest to come so early on, so they were already shouting orders. Truthfully, most hadn't needed their warnings. They knew their place well. They had no intention of getting in the way of such a big shot. However, Lionel didn't move an inch. He stood in the middle of the gates as though they were being prepared to be opened for him and him alone. "Did you not hear what we said?" Scram. This was their last chance to scare Lionel away. They couldn't show such an unsightly appearance to this guest. They had been warned so many times that everything needed to be perfect. This was why they couldn't allow Lionel into the guild. And yet, this bastard was still causing trouble. They immediately unleashed their strength, bearing down on Lionel as though to show him that they weren't joking. Unfortunately for them, other than a slight fluttering of his hair, Lionel was completely unmoved. Both Xander and Rio were tier 4, making them quite powerful, truth be told. But Lionel had killed 4 such experts just yesterday. The horse and carriage continued to move forward. The oppressive pressure of the steed alone made Xander and Rio shiver, fear lighting their eyes. Lionel might not know the exact species of this steed, but they did. The Blood Mercury race. A steed with the temper of a demon and the patience of a lit fuse. And now it was too late to get out of its way. Lionel felt a billowing heat suddenly blow down the back of his neck. Chapter 925. Chapter 925. Lady Anya. Lionel's hair wafted beneath the wind. He could tell that if it wasn't for his innate fire elemental affinity, this breath alone might have been enough to scorch his skin. He turned back, an indifferent look lighting his eyes. It was as though he couldn't see the fear in the guards nor the surrounding experts. When Lionel's gaze met the steed's, the latter trembled slightly, its nostrils flaring and its body tensing. For some reason this steed felt a large amount of pressure from Lionel. It wasn't the kind of pressure that said Lionel was stronger than it, but rather just the kind of pressure that said it should be afraid. It was a very subtle difference, almost like it was looking at what Lionel might become rather than what he was. There were many races of people in the dimensional verse, humans and the Oryx being just two that Lionel had met to this point. However, there was a large dividing line between species, and this dividing line was humanoid versus bestial. Humanoid races of people like humans and Oryx evolved more to rely on their active abilities, and their talent was more malleable. But the consequence of this is that there are more untalented humans than there are talented ones. Bestial races evolved to rely on their innate abilities, and their talent is far less malleable. However, this likewise means that there are more talented beasts than there are humanoids. This major dividing line of knowing how to take and accepting what is given is maybe the most fundamental diverging path of evolution the dimensional verse had to offer, from which there were a myriad of differences that could be deduced. One such difference was that the instinct of bestial races happened to be far sharper than humanoid races. As such, this steed of the blood Mercury race was very much in tune with how much fear it should have for Lionel, and was thus far more prepared to act on it compared to humans. Lionel, who had been indifferent, suddenly smiled and reached out a hand. Under the stunned gazes of those watching, Lionel stroked the horse's jaw. At first, the steed trembled as though afraid that Lionel would harm it. But, when it sensed that Lionel had no ill intent, it neighed lightly, nudging at Lionel's hand. Xander and Rio were frozen in shock. Was this a horse of the blood Mercury race? Weren't they known for their fiery tempers? Weren't they able to stomp a mountain to rubble with a single hoof and disperse the clouds with a single neigh? What the hell was going on here? Little White? Is something the matter? At that moment a sudden voice rang out. It was so melodious and sweet that silence almost fell, the only thing gracing their ears being the flute-like whistling of the wind, as though it too wanted to show its appreciation. Lionel couldn't help but look up and toward the carriage. In his life he had only heard one other voice comparable. Suddenly hearing such a thing now caught him somewhat off guard. This voice didn't carry the same innate coercion, but something told Lionel that this was only because she was able to control it better. And even without this coercion, even without seeing her face, one could already feel the innate want and need to protect her. Just from this voice alone, Lionel could tell that this woman within the carriage was powerful. It had to be said that the carriage itself didn't have a driver, nor were there any windows. Clearly, this blood Mercury steed had more than enough intelligence of its own to find its destination on its own. But it was exactly because of this that the sudden and abrupt stop was out of the young woman's expectations. The guards suddenly snapped out of their shock and remembered their duty. However, by the time they wanted to figure out a path to take out of this so that they could avoid blame, the clicking sound of the carriage's doors opened, and then they all witnessed the descent of a goddess. The first thing any of them saw was the hem of her long white dress, so long in fact that it completely masked her feet, leaving it all to their imagination. The dress itself was quite plain and wasn't overly embroidered, but despite how loose it was around her legs, it still couldn't help but cling slightly to her hips. When the young woman's head dipped out of the carriage, it was like a refreshing breeze whistled through the world. The sun seemed dimmer, the skies more somber, even the beautiful streets of the guild paled, unable to match up. And this was all despite the fact this young woman wore a veil. Her long white hair fluttered, disappearing into the folds of her dress. A pair of golden eyes looked around curiously, an innocent twinkling within their depths that made one hope no harm would ever come to her. The only patches of her soft, fair skin one could see were upon her forehead and her slender, swan-like neck, and yet it was still enough to entice the masses. The young woman blinked when she saw Lionel petting her horse. She knew well the kind of temper her little White had. It didn't even allow others to get close, let alone touch her. This was a shocking scene indeed. Lady Anya. I'm sorry for failing to greet you. At that moment, several powerful auras surged out from the guild, each wearing aggrieved expressions as the large gates were finally opened wide. This Lady Anya was really too difficult to get a read on. She had just informed them minutes ago that she wanted to take her exam now, yet she was already here. She didn't give them time to prepare much of anything. All this time, though, Lady Anya, who was still part descended and part not from her carriage, continued to look at Lionel with an almost childlike curiosity in her eyes. "Who are you? Why are you in Lady Anya's way?" One of the elders immediately snapped upon seeing Lionel's back, her aura bearing down with the pressure of a Tier 7 existence as though she had every intention of slaughtering him where he stood. Chapter 926. Chapter 926, Justice. The aura washed through the streets. The spectators felt as though their hearts were suddenly caught in their throats, and the two guards, Xander and Rio, caught in the line of fire, almost wanted to prostrate themselves to the ground. Everyone seemed to look toward Lionel, who must have been feeling the brunt of it. Some had expressions of subterfuge, others pity, and others were just focused on staying out of it, not wanting to get dragged into this mess. However, what no one expected was for Lionel to suddenly look back and gaze toward the older woman who had yelled at him as though he was seeing a savior. "Ah, you finally came. I really need your help." Lionel dashed to stand before the woman, ignoring the beautiful Lady Anya and Little White. Among the two of them, though, it seemed that Little White was the most dissatisfied with Lionel's departure, as she was very much enjoying being pet. Lionel stood before the older woman with a half-pleading expression as though a child seeking out his grandmother for being wronged. Obviously, the older woman had no security to speak of. After all, even though crafters usually had poor combat prowess, they were also known for having various crafts to make up for that gap. If there was any singular group of people with the most trump cards in the world, it was definitely a force crafter. And, more specifically, a force crafter who was nearing the end of their lifespan and had little else to do but tinker in hopes of a breakthrough. Plus, the older woman was a Tier 7 existence. She wasn't under any threat from anyone. Even the guards of the guild should be afraid of her. The only reason she was even making a public appearance now was due to Lady Anya's own appearance. This was all to say that not only was there no one who blocked Lionel, but there was also no one even in position to block him to begin with. In the blink of an eye, he had appeared before the older woman. Due to their difference in height, he was practically towering over her, and yet he still managed to seem like the harmless child in this exchange. "Ma'am, you seem to be very powerful and have high standing, right? Then I ask that you please administer justice for me. I just spent the last half day going through customs, and this is my first time in the guild's territory. I have to say that I'm in awe of its beauty and grandeur, and up until the moment I reached the gates, I was enthusiastic and excited to become a great crafter. However, when I got to the gates and presented my documents, these two guards here actually tore them up. I was appalled. The dignity of the guild was actually being blasphemed in such a way, even two guards dared to simply shred its prestige in the face of so many eyewitnesses. I have to say that I've never felt more terrible, even my heart aches. I was told that the Force Crafting Guild was the best place to be for my future, that it was a place where anyone could become a crafter so long as you had the skill. But I was turned away just because I wanted to take the Force Crafter's exam. These two, Xander and Rio, even implied that they'd turn me away every time I came. Please help me." Lionel's voice was imploring and moving, it even looked like he might shed a real tear at any moment. On top of that, he had spoken so quickly and with such conviction and clarity that despite being stunned, the old woman who had had every intention of blowing her top, could only be shocked to the point of deflating like a balloon. It was clear that even she couldn't ignore the slight coercion in Lionel's voice. In fact, many of those who were listening, even when they had been sneering before, suddenly felt the need to feel bad for him. If the old woman had gathered her thoughts first, maybe she would have had a different reaction. But, seeing Lionel's plea and how he suddenly swung his body to point toward the two pale guards, she spoke before she even realized what was happening. "Is what he says true?" The old woman regretted her words almost instantly. This wasn't what she should have asked. She should have pretended that Lionel was speaking nonsense and told him to scram, maybe even find a trumped-up charge to have him arrested or banned from their world. However, since she asked this, she had opened up a can of worms. "Damn it. Deny it. Deny it, you fools," the old woman screamed in her mind. Xander and Rio, having no idea what the old woman was thinking, panicked. All they could remember was Lionel pointing out all of the cameras, not to mention pointing out that he had recorded the event personally as well. How could they assume that the older woman would be willing to lie for them? They both thought they were caught. They only hoped that by telling the truth they could get a lesser punishment. The two lowered their heads and gripped their fists. "Why yes, it's true. You," the older woman pointed a wrinkled finger toward the both of them. To outsiders, it looked as though she was enraged by their foul conduct. But the reality was that she was infuriated by the fact they hadn't dared to be foul enough. How was she supposed to deal with this situation now? Not only had their branch guild made a terrible first impression, but in order to save some face she might even have to extend some sort of olive branch to this troublemaker. She practically seared Lionel's face into her memories. She was already thinking of several ways to make Lionel's life a living hell. Since he wanted to be in the guild so bad, she would show him what it meant to be in the guild. Chapter 927. Chapter 927. Who said? Just when the older woman was about to reach a decision for what to do, a sudden aura approached. Angneril appeared in their midst not long later, scanning the situation with a hint of helplessness marring his brow. After a split moment he bowed respectfully. Lady Anya, Elder Isoltine, he greeted Anya and the older woman, giving the other elders a cursory greeting as well. My apologies, there's been a mistake at the border. Lionel Morales, correct? Since this mistake is on me and my department, how about I extend you a green VIP card? You'll be able to enter and exit guild territory for a year without fees or due process. I'll just take a day to finish the procedures and then you can go about your business. Will that be okay? Lionel's pleading expression had already vanished toward one of neutrality. He already realized that there wasn't much of a point in keeping the act up. The moment this Angneril appeared, the situation was already far out of his control. Unless he was willing to completely fall out with the Force Crafting Guild and battle it out right here, this was as far as he would go. Plus, how would that end anyway? In order to get anything out of it, he would probably have to just plunder the treasure stores of the guild. If he really did that, had just gained himself another powerful enemy. From what Lionel understood, this Force Crafting Guild was just a small branch. But it represented the prestige of the main branch as well. No one would be let off after just randomly plundering an entire guild, unless he could hide his identity. But it was already too late for that. He didn't have enough skill to fool all those scanners and sensors just yet, nor did he have the time to invest in creating the force crafts or arts that could. This was why he didn't even bother to try for a disguise this time. However, if he kept running into trouble like this, it might be a worthwhile investment. All this said, this so-called green VIP Angneril spoke of might be a worthy trade-off. If he ever got his hands on it, that is. It was clear that by Angneril saying it would take a day, that they still wanted Lionel to get out of their sights as quickly as possible. And it didn't take a genius to understand that all of this was for Anya. Seeing the sudden indifference on Lionel's face, Angneril's gaze narrowed. He knew well how Lionel had managed to slip through the cracks. The immigration practices across the universe was actually not much different from what you might find on Earth. Visas, citizenship, green cards, workers' permits. Even if they might not always go by the same name, the concepts are the same. For more stringent worlds like this one, even for a vacation, you had to meet certain standards comparable to what most worlds would ask to become a citizen. In that case, the algorithm had a test for youth and talent, obviously preferring people of a certain caliber to enter these walls. Lionel's talent was so great that even under the modified algorithm, he still managed to get through the screening which led to this situation. Ultimately, everyone else thought that Lionel was a country bumpkin stirring up trouble. But Angneril knew well that things weren't so simple. In fact, if it wasn't because of Anya, he might be forced to fawn over Lionel instead. Still, he had no choice but to pick his battles. At that moment, though, he felt as though Lionel was seeing right through him, unfazed by his word games and his attempts at pleasing both parties. In truth, Lionel was infuriated. He valued respect above most things, and right now he felt like his time was being wasted because these people thought it was better to anger him en route to pleasing Lady Anya. This so-called green VIP card he would be given, regardless of how rare or nice it was, practically felt like a pat on the head he would receive for being a good boy. He had followed all the rules, done everything he needed to do, and even up until this point he had yet to lash out at anyone, but it simply didn't matter. Even in a situation where you did everything perfectly and as they should be done, if those with power wanted to find fault with you, they would find it. So, while Lionel stared at Angneril emotionlessly, about to begrudgingly accept his proposal since he had no real choice in the matter, he had already remembered these matters in his heart. Excuse me? Before Lionel could speak, that sweet voice rang out again. As though moths to a flame, all the elders and Angneril turned over. All they were missing were tails to wag. Anya blinked her large, golden eyes. Though it was hard to tell with her veil on, she looked to be at most around 17 years old. Though she had the voice of a mature woman. Did I come at the wrong time? If we can't take our exams today, I can just come back another time. The expressions of the elders changed. How were they supposed to respond to this? Were they supposed to say that they were barring others from taking their exams just so that she could do so alone? But saying such a thing so bluntly would cause problems. Plus, no one had known she was here to take an exam even if they had some guesses. Until right this very moment. Now it was almost impossible to hide it. Luckily, Engnaro was quick on his feet. No, it isn't that, Lady Anya. The problem is that our small branch is most suited to give black grade exams. Even all the elders here had to travel to larger branches to receive their bronze certifications. So, in order to prepare and be certified for you bronze grade exams, we had to set up a lot of things. As of right now, we couldn't hand out a black grade exam even if we wanted to. That is why we're turning so many people away. The elders quickly nodded, feeling that Engnaro was truly quick on his feet to think of such an excuse. Plus, it wasn't entirely incorrect either. It had some kernels of truth to it. But it was then that Lionel's lip curled. Who said I wasn't here to take a bronze grade exam? Did you even ask? Chapter 928. Chapter 928. Engnaro was stunned. He had thought his plan to be foolproof, but now he could only try his best to hold back an ugly expression. According to the files, Lionel was Tier 1. In addition, the scan hadn't caught the sign of any other life forms on him, so it was most likely that he didn't have a spirit by his side, making it so that his force crafting would be limited. Of course, spirits were rare, so this wasn't exactly a negative on Lionel, it was just an observation, one that was just as important as the first. As someone who was in Tier 1, it was impossible for Lionel to have had the soul force needed to craft bronze treasures for long. In addition, considering Lionel's age, Engnaro would guess that Lionel had been in the 5th dimension for a month or two at best. Any longer, and considering his talent, he would have progressed far more than he had. This was all to say that if Engnaro had to assign a probability, he would guess with 97% assuredness that Lionel was not a bronze crafter and was, at best, a quasi-bronze crafter, a feat that was still very much excellent for his age. In fact, Engnaro thought that he had vastly overestimated Lionel as well. But hearing this, he felt like he was at a loss for words. The elders looked over toward Lionel as though they wanted to tear him to shreds, especially Isoltine. It was clear that none of them believed Lionel. They weren't aware of what Lady Anya's backing was exactly, but they knew of the person who requested for them to take care of her. Such a person wasn't an individual they could afford to offend, and yet even they were subservient to Anya. This was enough to tell them just what a fearsome existence Lady Anya must be. And yet, this little troublemaker was trying to ruin everything. Unfortunately, before they could say anything, Anya's expression lit up. She clapped her hands together, her slender fingers and delicate palms turning red at just the slight strain. That's excellent. Then we can take the exams together. Anya seemed to be excited. Her smile bloomed beneath her veil, but it was just a shame that they could only catch the faintest shadow of it all. At that moment, the elders knew the situation was helpless. They didn't even get the chance to twist Lionel's arm into admitting that he was lying. It was all very infuriating. However, the troublemaker himself no longer spared them a glance, smiling in thanks to Anya. Lionel had never blamed Anya to begin with. After all, it was clear that this had all been done without her knowledge. At the same time, he also had a feeling that she wasn't as naive as she was pretending to be. Clearly she was helping him. For this he was grateful. A beauty who also had a kind heart. Worthy of praise indeed. Engnaro and the elders looked at each other, not quite knowing what to do. But Anya pushed them along with her next words. Little White is getting tired after pulling my carriage along all day. She would like to graze and relax a bit. I hope that we can start the exams sooner rather than later so she can have some rest. Yes. Isoltine reacted. Please, this way. Anya didn't bother to enter her carriage once again, walking beside Little White with a light smile on her face. Thank you. Lionel's voice was neither too loud nor too soft, so the elders leading the way forward, including Engnaro, definitely heard him aim these words toward Anya. And yet, they could only pretend like they hadn't heard a thing. Anya looked over toward Lionel with sparkling eyes, her gaze carrying a hint of mischief, another hint of intelligence, and a splash of curiosity and kindness as she examined Lionel's face. Anya. Lionel chuckled. I'm Lionel. Just Lionel? Anya blinked. Just Anya? Lionel replied. All right, Lady Anya. Anya said triumphantly. Lionel was speechless for a moment before he burst out into a fit of laughter. What was truly adorable was that little white followed along with Lionel's lead, letting out successive jijiji sounds. Anya felt betrayed. Little White seemed to like Lionel even more than her. Across galaxies, Aina walked through a mansion under the escort of a maid, a cold expression hidden beneath her black mask. "Here, Miss Brazinger." Aina nodded and entered the room. However, she was a bit surprised to find that there wasn't anything but an empty desk and chair. Of course, there were other office-like decorations like bookcases and the like. But other than that, the person she was sent here to meet was nowhere to be seen. "Sorry for not being able to meet you face to face, Miss Brazinger. However, we're in a bit of a sensitive time at the moment. I had no choice but to bring you forward like this." Aina understood and didn't say much as the sudden voice pervaded the room. It was impossible to tell where it came from and even more impossible to pinpoint where the force art sustaining it was. So, there was no point in bothering. "I'll get right to the point. I have a mission for you." Aina was prepared for as much. She had accepted Richard's proposal to join his faction for a few simple reasons. For one, she didn't particularly care what sort of position it put her father in. This wasn't to say that she didn't care about her father, but rather that they weren't a family that harped over minor details. Political strife wasn't something they took seriously. Secondly, Richard's proposal provided her the most training resources. It was as simple as that. Nothing more, nothing less. However, she was also aware that there was nothing free in this world. But she didn't mind. These missions would just be more opportunity to train and hone her skills. Your target is the Luxnix family. Chapter 929. Chapter 929. Show me. Lionel and Anya were escorted into a large room. There was just a single workbench present at the very center of it all and 5 chairs prepared for the elders that would be, presumably, overseeing it all. Clearly, they had only prepared a single workbench believing that Anya would be the only one taking her exams, but Lionel had thrown a wrench into those plans. To make matters worse, Lionel and Anya seemed to be laughing and joking amongst each other as though they were 2 old friends. It was difficult for the elders to even interject with any snide remarks without simultaneously offending Anya herself, who was clearly enthusiastically responding to everything Lionel said. So they could only bite their tongues. In truth, they didn't care about whether 1 or 2 people took the exam now. Their issue with Lionel wasn't that he was here, but rather that he had made them lose face. Every happy interaction Lionel had with Anya was like another slap to their faces. It was as though they felt like he was snatching the good impression Anya was supposed to have of them for himself. Agnero followed along with furrowed brows. He was meant to act as an ambassador for Anya, so he wasn't necessarily participating in this as a crafter. But that only made his emotions even more complicated than the other elders. In the end, there was Elder Isoltine, who would have very much liked to lop Lionel's head off his neck. But she too could only stifle herself. "I thought that you would be mean, but you're actually very nice," Anya said with a giggle. Lionel raised an eyebrow. "Mean? Since when did he give off that sort of impression?" "Mean? Mitchum. Your eyes always look like they're calculating something, like you have a barrier up for the world. Plus, there's something dangerous coming off from your body that you seem to be suppressing. You should smile more, yours is not bad to look at." Anya seemed to be commenting offhand, not thinking very much about what she was saying as her soothing voice tickled their eardrums. But Lionel felt his heart skip a beat. Was he like that? He had always thought himself to be quite charismatic. He had even managed to turn a school of nobles into one with a student body that actually respected a commoner like him. Lionel would often think of those times as he hopped from organization to organization, baffled as to why he couldn't have the same positive effect on them he had had on Royal Blue Academy. Why was it that he made enemies everywhere he went and yet he was probably the most popular guy in his school? The dichotomy was something he had always blamed on the dimensional verse. It was a place that could even ignore his own charisma because it was more intent on fighting and killing than forging relationships and building a kind heart. But was that true? What if he was just receiving the energy he was putting out? Lionel didn't think the answer was so simple. There definitely were cruel factors in the dimensional verse he couldn't control. But did that mean he had to close himself off completely? Lionel's pale violet eyes seemed to glow lightly. His emotional intelligence and charisma were among the most useful traits he had, but it seemed that he had been handicapping himself. He rarely led with his charisma anymore. He was more apt these days to lead with indifference and only open up to a smile if someone responded the way he wanted them to. but that built up a flaw in his character. He had been so on guard against the dimensional verse that he was changing even himself to fit the parts he hated so much about it. What an irony. Lionel couldn't help but gaze at Anya quite deeply. This woman had only known him for about 10 minutes. Was it a coincidence she had said something so profound? Or was it deeper than that? There you go, calculating again, Anya said with a pout. Lionel didn't seem to mind this and smiled instead. You're quite smart for a little girl. Who's a little girl? I'm already a woman, I'll have you know. I'm 20 years old. Anya stuck her ample chest out as though to prove a point, but all she got from Lionel was more laughter, causing her pout to only grow more pronounced. Thank you, Lionel suddenly spoke seriously. That's already twice today. I guess I owe you 2 favors now. Anya smiled knowingly but didn't say much of anything else. At that moment, Elder Isoltine cleared her throat, taking the central position of the 5 chairs. The room was exceptionally hollow, making their voices echo. It was obvious that this room was usually able to test thousands of amateur crafters at a time. But now it would only test 2. Apologies, we only prepared a single bronze workbench. No problem, Granny. I don't really need a workbench. Elder Isoltine's jaw clenched so hard it twitched. Who was your granny? She cleared her throat, trying to bury her rage. We didn't prepare the theory section of the crafter's exam because we have reason to believe that Anya has already met the standard. But it is uncertain that. Elder Isoltine looked up toward Lionel, clearly wanting his name for the record. Usually, Lionel would just hand over his documents. But obviously this was impossible now. Unless he got a whole bunch of tape first. Lionel. He finished. Elder Isoltine all but rolled her eyes. We need your full name for the records. Right? Lionel chuckled, forgetting that he was no longer playing a game with Anya. Lionel Morales. Anya's eyes widened. She lifted her skirt, hopping to stand before Lionel and looking him up and down. She looked like a little girl who had found a new toy. The elders had no idea how to react to her antics. Do you have one? Show me. Show me. Lionel's lip twitched. Couldn't this girl choose her words more carefully? Chapter 930? Chapter 930 Certification. What are you talking about? Lionel chuckled and shook his head. Though he could make a few guesses, he still didn't jump to any conclusions. Who knew what this girl was asking to see? In truth, Lionel knew that he was a bit too casual with his treasures. He didn't put enough effort into hiding them. A portion of the reason why was because he didn't have a good frame of what was rare and what wasn't, but another was definitely that he was just a bit careless. The more powerful Lionel became, the more he felt that the people of this quadrant were actually quite weak. He felt like the difference between him and them wasn't very far apart even while he was in the 3rd dimension, let alone now that he was in the 5th. Even Elder Isoltine, who had experienced 2 watersheds of the 5th dimension, wasn't able to make him feel any pressure. However, Lionel's experiences in the dimensional cleanse trial world showed him that it wasn't that the world was weak, but rather that his scope of the world was too small. Even while so heavily suppressed and with himself having every advantage, he had still lost so miserably to Amory. If it was just this, things might have been fine. After all, Amory was in the 6th dimension while he hadn't even truly stepped into Tier 1 of the 5th dimension. However, Lionel felt that if it wasn't for the suppression of the trial, he wouldn't have stood a chance against Kira while he had been at the peak of the 4th dimension. Even beyond that, he didn't believe that defeating even the likes of Richard and that other man would have been a simple matter either. If there was anything that trial taught Lionel, it was that he shouldn't underestimate this world. There would be nothing simple about achieving his goals. This was all to say that he felt that if he was going to really do this, he had to learn to be a bit more cautious about some things. So, he didn't immediately guess at what it was Anya wanted to see. Don't be like that, Anya said with an almost pleading tone. You know, just because you heard my last name, are you really sure of my origins? Can't there be other people with the Morales name that aren't from where you think him from? Anya pouted. Isn't the fact you said that enough to prove that I am right? Then again, only ignorant people say stuff like that. Maybe you really aren't from them. Lionel's lip twitched. He was finding it harder and harder to get a read on this girl. Was she mischievous? Introspective? Empathic? Or was it just that she enjoyed pointing out his flaws so much? Seeing that Lionel wasn't reacting as fast as she wanted him to, Anya shook her head and turned toward the elders. I can vouch for Lionel. His skill in theory is maybe better than mine. I don't come from a family of crafters, but his family is one that can ignore even the main branch of the Force Crafting Guild and not suffer from it. In fact, the main branch was only created so that other families would have a way of countering them. Good enough. Okay. Let's move on to the application part. Hearing these words, the elders froze, looking toward Lionel with incredulous expressions. By now, though, Lionel was certain that what Anya wanted to see was little Tali. If not for this, she wouldn't be so eager to move on to the application portion of the exam. As for the reaction of the elders, he didn't particularly care. Lionel knew that he didn't have much relation to the Morales family. For all he knew, they were quite hostile to him. Of course, this wouldn't stop him from participating in their air wars. And it most definitely wouldn't stop him from allowing these elders to misunderstand. This was an opportunity to save himself some trouble, so why wouldn't he take advantage? Elder Isoltine wasn't sure how to accept this information. On the one hand, she didn't want to believe it. But on the other, she couldn't refute this young girl either. Even if she reached out and said that she wanted half the resources of their branch, Isoltine would just have to accept it. Ignarel stood a distance away with his face also having frozen. But there was nothing he could do either. Then, Isoltine cleared her throat. We will begin with the spirit control portion of the exam. A strong pressure descended after Isoltine clapped her hands. However, Lionel felt that his body was perfectly fine. If there was any change at all, it was a slight sluggishness in his soul force. That was when he understood. This pressure was supposed to make it more difficult for you to use your soul force freely. This sort of control was invaluable for a crafter. 2 sets of rings appeared before Lionel and Anya, stretching out a 10-meter distance from them. There were just a pair of rings before each of them, one within arm's reach and the other exactly 10 meters away. However, somehow this 10-meter distance felt like infinity. Take control of your familiars to travel the distance between these rings. A minimum travel distance of 1 meter is necessary to pass. Please begin. One moment. Lionel suddenly called out. I have a question. Isoltine, who still couldn't stand the sight of Lionel's face, still had no choice but to accommodate him for now. At the very least, she had to until they could corroborate Anya's words. It was obvious that Anya had just met Lionel, so how could they take her words for fact? Especially when they didn't want to believe these words to begin with. Yes. Is it only possible to become a Tier 1 bronze crafter during this exam? What do I need to do to aim for a higher certification? Isoltine's expression darkened. We can certify up to the Tier 3 bronze grade. However, that requires a minimum of 3 meters crossed for this test. She truly felt like her time was being wasted. Lionel shook his head. Was there that much of a difference between Tier 1 and 3? If it wasn't for the fact he needed the resources of this place, he wouldn't even bother. All right. Lionel nodded. Flipping his palm over, a smooth ball of silver appeared, bobbing up and down above his hand. Anya's eyes lit up. However, when the elders saw it, their gazes lit up with something far different than an innocent curiosity. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.